He didn't hesitate. That was the part nobody who witnessed it could ever forget. Not the nurse who pressed herself against the far wall. Not the attending physician who found something urgent to study on his clipboard. Not the single bodyguard stationed outside the door who heard everything and spent the rest of his life pretending he hadn't. Vincent Moretti looked down at the infant in the hospital bassinet. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, pink-faced and screaming the way all newborns scream, furious at the cold shock of the world. And his expression didn't change. Not a flinch, not a flicker. He looked at that baby the way a man looks at a receipt for something he never ordered. Then he turned to his wife. "Get rid of it," he said. "Both of you." Elena Brooks Moretti had just survived 31 hours of labor. Her hands were still shaking. There was an IV line taped to the inside of her left arm. And her husband, the man she had married in a candlelit ceremony 6 years earlier, the man who had wept at their wedding, genuinely wept, she had seen the tears, stood 3 feet away from his newborn son and told her to disappear. If you've ever been thrown away by someone who was supposed to love you, if you've ever watched a door close on something that couldn't be undone, then you already know what Elena felt in that moment. You know it in your chest before your brain catches up. This is the story of what that decision cost everyone it touched. Before you go any further, if stories like this keep you up at night, hit that like button right now and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe if you haven't already, because what comes next in this series will shake you to your core. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The hospital was private. Of course it was private. Vincent Moretti didn't do anything that left a public record if he could help it. Not meetings, not payments, not the birth of his children. The facility sat behind a gated entrance off a 2-lane road outside the city. The kind of place where the staff understood that discretion wasn't just professional courtesy, it was the condition of their employment. Nobody asked questions about the man in the charcoal suit who occupied the corner suite's waiting area with 2 associates who never sat down and never made eye contact with the nurses. Vincent had arrived at the hospital 4 hours into Elena's labor. Not because he'd been summoned, she hadn't called him, had been afraid to call him, which itself said everything about the state of their marriage by that point, but because his driver had heard it from her housekeeper, and the housekeeper had told the driver because she was terrified of what Vincent would do if he found out later that he hadn't been informed. That was how the Moretti household worked. Information moved through it not out of care, but out of self-preservation. He sat in that waiting room for a long time, drank 2 cups of coffee, made 3 phone calls, none of which appeared to be about his wife or the child being born down the hall. At one point, his consigliere, a compact, watchful man named Sal Greco, arrived and sat beside him, and the 2 of them talked in low voices for nearly 40 minutes. The nurses who passed by couldn't catch the words. But they noticed that whatever Sal said, Vincent's jaw tightened in a way it hadn't before Sal arrived. That conversation, that 40 minutes. Nobody fully understood its weight until much later. When the doctor appeared in the doorway to tell Vincent he had a son, Vincent stood, straightened his jacket, walked down the hall the way he walked into every room, like the space rearranged itself to accommodate him. Elena was still catching her breath when he pushed open the door. She saw his face and knew immediately that something was wrong. Not the normal kind of wrong, not the Vincent Moretti brand of controlled displeasure she'd learned to navigate over 6 years of marriage. This was something colder, something that had already been decided before he stepped across the threshold. "Vincent?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Come see him." He didn't move toward the bassinet. "Who else have you been with?" he said. The room dropped 10 degrees. "What?" "You heard me?" The nurse, a young woman, barely 25, 3 months into the job, made the mistake of still being in the room. She busied herself with a chart on the far counter and tried to become part of the wall. "Vincent, that is your son." Elena's voice cracked on the last word. Not from weakness, from the sheer effort of staying controlled when every instinct was telling her to scream. "He is your son. You can see it. Just look at him." "Sal tells me you were seen." Vincent's voice was completely flat. No anger, no accusation, just the tone of a man reporting a fact he found inconvenient. "Last winter, 2 times, with the Ferrara boy." Marco Ferrara is 22 years old and he works at the restaurant as a floor manager, and I spoke to him twice about event bookings, and whoever told Sal that story is lying to you. Maybe. Vincent looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the bassinet. Maybe not. He has your eyes, Vincent. He has your eye. I don't want him. 3 seconds of absolute silence. The nurse put down her chart and left the room without a word. Some instincts are older than professionalism. Elena pushed herself upright in the bed, pulling against the soreness in every muscle, and stared at her husband with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Not fear, not the practiced composure she'd developed over years of managing his moods. Something rawer than both. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that you're going to walk away from a newborn baby because Sal Greco told you something. I'm telling you I'm done." He adjusted his cufflinks, an unconscious habit. He always touched his cufflinks when he was closing a conversation. "You'll receive a settlement, enough to be comfortable. You'll sign papers agreeing to stay out of the city and out of my business. The child—" And there was the smallest pause, almost nothing, but Elena caught it. "The child goes with you. His name is Adrian." Vincent didn't react to the name. That was almost worse than if he had. "You have 48 hours to leave the hospital and 3 days to be out of state." He turned toward the door. "Don't contact me again." "Vincent." Her voice stopped him. Not because she raised it. She didn't, but because of what was underneath it. "If you walk out of that door, I will make sure that boy knows exactly what kind of man his father is. Every detail. I'll give him the truth like a gift on every birthday until he's old enough to use it." Vincent paused with his hand on the door frame. "Then make sure he's sharp enough to survive it," he said, and he left. Elena sat in that hospital room for a long time after the door closed. The baby, Adrian, had quieted down and was making the small, investigating sounds that newborns make, testing the world with his lungs in small installments. Elena looked at the ceiling. She didn't cry. She had never been a woman who cried easily, which was partly temperament and partly what 6 years with Vincent Moretti did to a person. It either broke you or it filed your emotions down to something harder and more precise. She picked up her son. He was warm, heavier than she expected, even though she'd been carrying him for 9 months. He smelled like something she didn't have a word for. Clean and new and already specific, already himself. He blinked up at her with Vincent's dark eyes, in a face that was still figuring out what shape it wanted to be. "Okay," she said quietly. Just that one word. She didn't tell Adrian what his father had said. He was 7 hours old and couldn't understand language yet. But she told him anyway, in the way mothers talk to infants, not for comprehension, but for contact. She told him that they were going to leave, that it would be hard, that hard didn't mean impossible, and that his father's decision was his father's failure, not theirs, and that she was going to spend every day making sure he understood the difference. She asked the nurse, a different nurse, an older woman named Patrice, who had been doing this for 22 years and had seen enough to be unshockable, to help her start making calls. She had one friend outside the city she trusted completely. She had access to a savings account Vincent didn't know about, because Elena Brooks had been raised by a mother who told her, "Always keep something for yourself because no man, no matter how good he seems, is permanent." It wasn't much, but it was enough to move. She left 4 days later. Middle of the week. No announcement. The settlement papers arrived at her new address 6 weeks after that, delivered by a courier who didn't make eye contact, and she signed them because the alternative was a legal fight she couldn't afford against attorneys who were paid to bury people. Vincent Moretti returned to his empire. Elena Brooks went back to being Elena Brooks. And Adrian, who weighed 9 pounds by the time they left the hospital, who had already developed the habit of curling his left hand into a small, furious fist while he slept, grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in a city 300 miles away, in a school district that wasn't great, wearing clothes that were good enough, eating meals that were planned carefully because the money had to stretch. He grew up knowing his father's name because Elena had kept that promise. Not with anger. She was too smart for that. Understood that feeding a child on pure rage just grows you someone who can't think straight, but with information. Facts. The kind of account that lets a person form their own conclusions. By the time Adrian was 12, he could have drawn you a rough organizational chart of the Moretti Syndicate's legitimate business holdings. By 14, he understood how those businesses moved money that started somewhere a lot darker. By 16, he had begun to understand something his mother hadn't fully intended to teach him: the architecture of power, where it sat, what held it up, what would happen if you pulled the right piece out from the bottom. He didn't talk about it much. That was the thing about Adrian that teachers noticed and couldn't quite categorize. He was sharp, clearly sharp, but he kept it close. Not shy, not closed off, just deliberate. He said things when he had decided it was worth saying them, and the rest of the time he watched. He had the kind of stillness that made adults slightly uncomfortable without being able to say why. His mother noticed it and said nothing. She recognized it. She had married it, once. The apartment they lived in for most of Adrian's childhood had a window in the kitchen that looked directly into the brick wall of the building next door. There was maybe 3 feet of space between the two structures. No light came through except at noon in summer, when the sun was high enough to wedge itself in sideways and lay a single stripe across the linoleum floor. Elena would sometimes stand at that window while she was waiting for something on the stove, just looking at that brick wall. She wasn't sad about it exactly. It was more that she was waiting for something she couldn't name, something that had more space in it than 3 feet of alley and borrowed light. She worked. She worked hard and without complaint, which was another thing she'd gotten from her mother. Administrative coordinator at a logistics firm, then office manager, then operations supervisor after she went back and finished the business degree she'd abandoned when she married Vincent. She was good at it. She had a mind for systems, for seeing how the moving parts of a thing fit together and where the inefficiencies were creating drag. Her employers liked her and were slightly afraid of her competence, which was exactly the right balance. She dated once, a few years after leaving Vincent, a quiet man named Paul who taught middle school history and made her laugh and was kind to Adrian in the careful way of a man who knew he was not the boy's father and wasn't trying to be. It lasted 2 years and ended without drama. They wanted different things and were mature enough to admit it before it curdled. She didn't try again after Paul, not because she'd given up, but because Adrian was in high school by then and she was tired in a specific way that didn't leave room for the vulnerability of new love. Adrian, meanwhile, was becoming something. He got into a state university on a partial scholarship and a handful of smaller grants Elena had spent 3 evenings helping him find and apply for. He studied business and finance with the intensity of someone who already understood what he was preparing for, though if you'd asked him directly, he would have given you an answer about career goals that was technically accurate and completely incomplete. He worked 2 jobs through school, one at a copy shop, one doing data entry for a small investment firm, and graduated in 3.5 years because he didn't have the money to afford the extra semester of leisurely scheduling that some of his classmates enjoyed. His first job out of college was at a regional accounting firm. 6 months later, he moved to a financial consulting company. A year after that, he was at a boutique investment advisory in a glass building downtown, wearing suits that still weren't quite right because he was buying them at a place that charged reasonable prices for clothes that approximated the real thing without being it. He noticed the difference. He filed it away. He would correct it when the time was right. He sent money home to Elena every month starting from his first real paycheck. She told him not to. He did it anyway. They didn't discuss it further because they were both people who understood that some arguments aren't arguments. They're just how love looks when it's practical. He called her on Sundays. 30 minutes, sometimes an hour. She told him about work, about a neighbor's drama, about a book she was reading. He told her about the week, about a client, about something he'd eaten that was surprisingly good. Neither of them talked about Vincent. There was an agreement between them, unspoken but solid as concrete, that Vincent Moretti existed as information, as data to be understood and used, but not as a wound to be poked at every week. That discipline cost Elena more than it cost Adrian. He hadn't lost anything yet. He was still building. She was the one who lived every day with what had actually happened, with the specific texture of what it felt like to be discarded by a man in a hospital room while holding his screaming son. She managed it. She was Elena Brooks. She managed things. By the time Adrian was 28, he had enough money to buy the suits that fit correctly. He had also, in the spaces between his legitimate career, in the hours between midnight and 3 in the morning when the rest of the city was unconscious, begun building something else entirely. It started as research. That was how he told it to himself in the beginning. He was simply learning. The Moretti organization controlled significant portions of 3 industries in 2 states: waste management, commercial real estate, and hospitality. And the legitimate businesses were layered over a financial network that moved money from sources that couldn't be named in public documents. Adrian had grown up knowing the rough shape of this architecture. Now, as an adult with professional training and access to the kind of databases that weren't public, he could see it in detail. The detail was extraordinary, and extraordinarily vulnerable in exactly the ways Vincent had never bothered to shore up because Vincent had never encountered an adversary who thought like an accountant rather than a soldier. The first thing Adrian did was map it. Every shell company, every trust structure, every real estate holding that served as a node in the network. It took him 14 months. He kept everything in an encrypted system he'd built himself on hardware that was not connected to the internet, accessible only from a single location, with a destruction protocol that would have made a paranoid man feel comfortable. He was not particularly paranoid. He was simply careful, which is a different thing. The second thing he did was begin making introductions. There were men inside the Moretti organization who were unhappy. There always are in organizations built on fear, because fear is an efficient motivator right up until the moment it stops working, and then everything it was holding together starts to come apart at once. Vincent ruled through terror and through the generous distribution of money to those who earned it, but the money had been getting less generous in recent years, squeezed by the same economic pressures that squeezed everyone else, and the terror remained constant. The math on that wasn't favorable. Adrian didn't approach these men directly. He didn't approach them at all in the beginning. He simply made sure that certain information became available to certain people through channels that couldn't be traced back to him. Financial discrepancies. Evidence of Vincent skimming from the distribution pool in ways that could be verified if you knew where to look. The suggestion, never stated outright, always implied through the logic of the numbers themselves, that loyalty to the current structure was a worse investment than people had assumed. He did all of this in the same calm, methodical way he did everything, without anger visible on the surface. He ate dinner and went to work and called his mother on Sundays, and continued to exist as Adrian Brooks, financial consultant, a person Vincent Moretti had never heard of and had no reason to consider, which was the point. The first time one of Vincent's money routes went dark without explanation, Vincent had his people investigate for 3 weeks before concluding it was a local enforcement problem, a sheriff's deputy who had gotten greedy or gotten religion. He tightened other routes and moved on. The second time, a month later, he was less certain. He increased security, changed personnel, brought in a specialist to review the network architecture from the outside. The specialist found nothing, because there was nothing to find at that point. No external attack, no mole in the traditional sense. Just data, moving quietly, doing what data does when the right person understands its structure and has the patience to wait for it to compound. Vincent sat in his office on the 42nd floor of a building his organization technically owned through 4 layers of corporate structure. And he told Sal Greco that something was wrong and he couldn't name what it was yet. Sal nodded, said the right things, made the right concerned expression. And somewhere in that 42nd floor conversation, the outline of a truth began to emerge that neither of them could see yet. A shape in the dark, patient as a held breath. The abandoned son was coming home. He had not yet decided what he would do when he arrived. That was the part that kept him awake some nights. In his apartment, with its correct suits hanging in the closet and its encrypted hardware in the locked drawer in its window that, unlike his mother's kitchen window, looked out over actual sky. He knew what his father had done. He knew who had been in that room. He knew about Sal Greco's 40 minutes in the waiting room and what had been said and why, and what Sal had been protecting that had nothing to do with Vincent and everything to do with Sal's own quiet, long-term ambition. He knew all of it the way you know things when you have spent 2 years reading everything and talking to the right people very carefully. What he didn't know yet was the shape of justice. Whether he wanted his father destroyed or whether he wanted something more complicated than that. Whether the 21-year-old wound at the center of all this was asking for blood or for truth. He thought about that hospital room. He had no memory of it. He was 7 hours old, but he had his mother's account of it, delivered over the course of a dozen Sunday phone calls in careful increments, the way you hand someone something heavy. He had the shape of it. A man in a charcoal suit, cufflinks, the door. He thought about his mother standing at that kitchen window, looking at brick. He thought about a stripe of noon light on a linoleum floor. And he made a decision. Not about destruction. About something longer than that. Something that would require the kind of patience he had been practicing his entire life without realizing he was practicing it. He picked up his phone. dialed a number that wasn't saved in his contacts because he had memorized it and would never write it down. The man who answered was a former Moretti financial officer who had retired under circumstances that were not entirely voluntary and who had, over the last 8 months, come to understand that the young consultant who had approached him through a mutual acquaintance was not what he appeared to be. "It's time to move to the next phase," Adrian said. A pause on the line. "How long do you think before he figures out it's personal?" the man asked. Adrian looked out his window at the night sky, at the city spreading out below him in its grid of orange light and moving vehicles and a million lives stacked on top of each other. "Long enough," he said. The call lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Adrian knew because he timed everything, not out of compulsion, but out of discipline, the same reason he kept his closet organized by function and his encrypted files sorted by date and his thoughts, as much as possible, in order. 4 minutes and 11 seconds was enough to confirm what he needed, confirmed, and to end the conversation before it became something that could be used against either of them. He set the phone down on the table. Outside his window, the city was doing what cities do at 11:30 on a Tuesday, running on fumes, on ambition, on the particular kind of loneliness that only exists in places where 10 million people are packed close enough to hear each other breathe. He watched a cab turn a corner 6 floors below, watched the light change, watched a woman in a yellow coat walk fast in the direction of the subway and disappear down the stairs without breaking stride. He thought about what came next. What came next was complicated, not in the way of logistics. The logistics were mapped, had been mapped for months, were sitting in the encrypted drive in his desk drawer as clean and precise as an engineering diagram. Complicated in the other way, the human way, the way that didn't fit inside spreadsheets. He went to bed at midnight and lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling, and after 40 minutes got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table until the light outside changed from black to the particular gray that precedes dawn. He wasn't anxious. He had trained himself out of anxiety the way athletes train themselves out of bad form, through repetition, through recognizing the pattern, through choosing a different response. What he was, if he was honest with himself, was something he didn't have a clean word for. Not afraid, not excited. Something in between that lived in the chest and made the air feel slightly thicker than normal. He poured the coffee down the sink at 5:15, showered, dressed, and went to work. The office of Carver and Lind Financial Advisory occupied half of the 19th floor of a building downtown that smelled like carpet cleaner and ambition. Adrian had been there for 2 years. He was technically a senior consultant, which meant he managed 3 junior analysts, billed at a rate that sounded large until you divided it by the hours, and attended enough meetings to have developed a specific internal language for the particular quality of silence that falls when someone in a conference room says something they think is smart and it isn't. He was good at the job, better than he needed to be, which was the point. You don't build cover by being mediocre. You build it by being the person people want in the room, the person whose name comes up when a client needs someone reliable. He was that person. He had made himself that person with the same methodical care he applied to everything else. That morning, he had a 9 o'clock with a client named Hargrove, mid-size construction company, legitimate as far as Adrian had verified, looking to restructure some debt instruments ahead of a commercial real estate expansion. Hargrove was a large man who sweated through his shirt collars and compensated for being occasionally slow on the uptake by being aggressively cheerful. Adrian had come to genuinely like him in the limited way you like someone you see in a professional context and know nothing real about. He got through the Hargrove meeting, got through 2 follow-up calls and a lunch with one of the junior analysts who was smart and ambitious and slightly too eager to demonstrate both. He ate half a sandwich at his desk at 2 in the afternoon, looking at a document that appeared to be a client portfolio analysis and was in fact something considerably more sensitive. At 3:47, his phone vibrated. The name on the screen was listed as D. Walsh. It was not a name that would mean anything to anyone who picked up his phone, which was why he'd chosen it. The man on the other end was not named Walsh. He took the call in the stairwell. "There's a problem," the man said. His name was Ray Cutler. He was 53 years old, former logistics coordinator for the Moretti organization's Eastern Distribution Network, and he had the voice of someone who had spent decades in rooms where the wrong word got you hurt, low, measured, with a permanent quality of understatement. One of the accounts we moved last week. Someone's been asking questions about it. Who? Internal. One of Vincent's people on the finance side. Guy named Petrov. He's been running reconciliation reports, and something flagged. Adrian leaned against the stairwell wall, concrete at his shoulder, fluorescent light humming overhead. How deep did it flag? Deep enough that Petrov brought it to Sal. 2 seconds of silence. When? Yesterday afternoon. And you're telling me now? I'm telling you now because I found out an hour ago, Ray said, and there was a specific tightness in his voice that wasn't quite defensiveness and wasn't quite apology. I don't have the kind of access I used to have, Adrian. That's the whole point of me being out. I know. He did know. He also knew that an hour was an hour and that Sal Greco had had 24 hours to do things with what Petrov had brought him, and that whatever those things were had not yet made themselves visible. Okay, how specific was the flag? Petrov's a numbers man, not a street guy. He can see the shape of what happened. Money moved out of a structure it shouldn't have left. Routing he doesn't recognize, timing that doesn't match any authorized transaction he can find records of. But he can't tell you who did it or why. He just knows something's wrong. And Sal's response. From what I heard, Sal told him to sit on it and not bring it to Vincent yet. That landed differently than the rest of it. Adrian straightened slightly against the wall. Sal told him not to bring it to Vincent. That's what I heard, from a reliable source. From someone who was in the room. He thought about that for a moment, turned it over. Sal telling Petrov to keep it from Vincent wasn't protective. It wasn't Sal trying to investigate before bringing incomplete information to his boss. Sal was not a man who operated from caution. Sal was a man who operated from angles. Sal keeping something from Vincent meant Sal had a reason to keep it from Vincent, and Sal's reasons were always ultimately about Sal. All right, Adrian said, don't do anything different. Keep to the normal schedule. If someone reaches out to you through the old channels, you don't know anything. And if they reach out the other kind of way, they won't. He said it with more certainty than he felt. You're 3 years removed. You're retired. You have a grandkid in Ohio. You're not interesting to them. People like Vincent have long memories. Vincent doesn't know I exist yet. And Sal... He stopped, started again. Sal has his own reasons to keep this quiet for now. Trust the architecture, Ray. A pause. Then, you sound like your mother. That landed somewhere it wasn't expected to land. How do you mean? She used to say that, trust the plan. When things got sideways with the settlement, with the lawyers trying to squeeze her, she'd look at whatever the problem was and say, trust the plan. Like the plan was a person she knew personally. Adrian said nothing for a moment. He hadn't known Ray knew his mother. He'd known Ray was connected to the Moretti world during the period of the settlement, had known he was one of the men who'd handled logistics in those early years. He hadn't asked about the specifics because he hadn't wanted to know them until he needed to. I'll be in touch, he said. He ended the call and stood in the stairwell for another minute and a half, listening to the building breathe around him. The distant mechanical hum of the elevator, the muffled sound of a conversation 2 floors up, the particular silence of a space that doesn't belong to anyone. Then he went back to his desk and finished the portfolio analysis and sent 3 emails and answered 1 call from a client in Denver, and at 6:15 packed up his bag and rode the elevator down to the lobby and walked out onto the street in the rush hour crowd and disappeared into it the way he'd learned to disappear, not by being invisible, but by being exactly as visible as everyone else around him. Vincent Moretti's morning had started badly and declined from there. It started with a phone call at 6 a.m. from his operations head, a square-jawed man named Dominic Reyes, who had been with the organization for 18 years and was, in Vincent's estimation, reliable in the specific way of a tool that works until it doesn't. Without personality, without ambition beyond a certain level, useful for exactly the function it was built for. Dominic didn't call at 6 in the morning with good news. The Cartwright Street warehouse, Dominic said. There's a problem. Define problem. The inventory that was supposed to move Wednesday didn't move. The guys who were supposed to move it aren't answering. Vincent sat up in bed. The bedroom was large, expensively furnished, and completely quiet. He slept alone. Had slept alone for years by choice. He'd had relationships since Elena, had even come close to something that might have been called serious once. with a woman named Miriam who was sharp and well-dressed and had the sense to not ask questions. That had ended eventually because everything ended, and he decided after Miriam that the complications weren't worth what they cost. All three of them? All three. Since when? Since yesterday evening. Marco tried to reach them at 8, 9, 11, nothing. Vincent was already out of bed, already moving toward the closet. Not because he was going to the warehouse. He hadn't been physically present at an operation in 4 years, had structured things specifically so that his presence was never required and never traceable. But because standing still while information like this landed felt wrong. Get people over there, not the usual crew. Use the Polanski brothers. Already called them. They're on their way. What about the inventory itself? Unknown. We don't know if it's still there, or if it moved without us, or if... Dominic paused. We don't know yet. Vincent held the phone and looked at his reflection in the mirrored closet door. He was 61 years old. He looked, he thought, approximately 56, which was either good genetics or the particular preservation effect of controlled fury, and he had no interest in determining which. His hair had gone silver 7 years ago, and he had not dyed it because he had learned that silver hair in the right suit in the right room communicated something that brown hair at 61 simply didn't. Call me when the Polanski brothers report in, he said. And Dominic, yeah. Don't tell Sal yet. A half-beat pause, small enough that a less attentive person would have missed it. Sure, Dominic said. Vincent ended the call. He stood at the closet for a moment longer than necessary, running through the last 3 months in his head, the way he periodically ran through everything. Not out of anxiety, but out of maintenance, the way you check the structural integrity of something you depend on. 3 months. The money route that had gone dark in February. The distribution disruption in March that they'd attributed to a supply chain problem at the source. The Cartwright warehouse now. 3 incidents that each had an explanation and were starting to add up to a pattern that didn't have one. He got dressed, made coffee in the kitchen himself because his housekeeper didn't arrive until 8 and he didn't like waiting. Stood at the window and drank it and watched the city below him assemble itself into its daytime configuration. All those people going to all those places to do all those things, none of which involved the particular geometry of his own problems. He thought about Sal. Sal Greco had been his consigliere for 23 years. He had been, for most of those years, the person Vincent trusted most in the organization, not because Vincent was naive about trust, which he wasn't, but because Sal had proven himself repeatedly in situations where it would have been easier and more profitable to make other choices. Sal was intelligent. Sal was disciplined. Sal had once, in the early years, taken a significant personal loss to protect the organization's interests at a moment when most men would have protected themselves first. That was the accounting Vincent carried. It was a long account, and it was generally favorable, and it had been sufficient for 23 years. But there was a thing about Sal that Vincent had been watching, without fully acknowledging he was watching it, for the last 18 months or so. A quality of, not distance exactly, more like orientation. The way Sal's eyes moved in certain meetings, the speed of certain responses. The questions Sal didn't ask that Vincent would have expected him to ask. Small things. The kind of things that don't build a case but make you stand at a window with your coffee and think. He set the mug down on the counter and went to work. Sal Greco's office was on the same floor as Vincent's in the building on Meridian Avenue that served as the organization's primary legitimate hub. A commercial property management firm that was exactly what it claimed to be, mostly, with the adjustments for reality that made it useful. Sal's office was smaller than Vincent's, which was exactly as Sal had always wanted it. Sal believed strongly in the strategic value of appearing to occupy less space than you actually controlled. He was at his desk at 7:15 when Petrov knocked. Petrov was 29, Ukrainian-born, had an accounting degree from a solid university, and a mind that processed numbers the way other minds processed faces. With an automatic, effortless pattern recognition that was occasionally inconvenient. He was not political. He was not ambitious in the directional sense. He was the kind of person who noticed things because noticing things was simply how his mind worked, and he reported what he noticed because the alternative hadn't occurred to him as an option until recently. He came in and sat down and put a folder on the desk. Sal looked at the folder without opening it. Talk to me. The routing anomaly I flagged yesterday. Petrov's English was precise, slightly formal, the English of someone who learned it as an adult and had decided to do it correctly. I've been able to trace it further. It's not one transaction, it's 9. Over a period of, he paused, 7 months. Sal's expression didn't change. That was a skill he'd developed over decades. 7 months. Going back to last October, each one small enough to not trigger the monitoring thresholds we have in place. But the pattern, the routing structure is the same each time. Whoever did this knows our architecture. They know it very well. Internal. Or someone who was internal and isn't anymore. Or someone who had access to someone internal. Petrov folded his hands on his knee. The amounts taken they're not enormous. But the information they'd need to route money this way, to do it 9 times without setting off anything until I ran the specific reconciliation I happened to run, that's not guesswork, that's knowledge. Sal nodded slowly. He reached out and opened the folder, looked at the pages without appearing to read them closely, which meant he was reading them very closely. You haven't shared this with anyone else? No, I came to you first, as you asked yesterday. Good. Sal closed the folder. His thumb rested on the cover, pressing down slightly. I want you to put this in a secure file. Your most secure, nothing networked, and I want you to keep running the analysis. Go back further than October. See if there's anything before then. Petrov looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who is not political, but is not entirely without instincts. And Mr. Moretti. Mr. Moretti has a lot on his plate right now. Sal's voice was pleasant. The pleasantness of it was the most frightening thing in the room. I'll bring this to him when I have something complete to bring. You understand that? Nothing half finished. Of course. Petrov stood, picked up the folder. Leave that, Sal said. Petrov set it back on the desk and left. Sal sat alone with the folder for a long time. He didn't open it again. He didn't need to. He had already memorized what mattered in it. He sat and thought the way he always thought, in straight lines, in contingencies, in the particular forward-looking arithmetic of a man who had spent 23 years making sure that every outcome, good or bad, landed in a position where he had already prepared his next move. He picked up his personal phone. Not the work phone, not the second phone he used for sensitive calls, but the third one. The one with a number he'd changed 6 times in the last 2 years. He dialed from memory. 2 rings. Then, yeah. We have a development. Sal kept his voice level, uninflected. It's accelerating faster than we planned for. I need to move the timeline. A pause on the other end. How much faster? Weeks, maybe less. He looked at the closed office door. The question on the table is whether our friend in the dark is ready to be found, or whether finding him on our schedule is still an option. That's not a question I can answer. Find someone who can, Sal said, and ended the call. The Polanski brothers found the 3 missing men at 10:40 in the morning. They were in the back of the Cartwright warehouse, which had not been used for anything since the previous night's inventory problem. The inventory was gone. Every crate, every pallet, every documented and undocumented item that had been slated for Wednesday's movement. Gone as cleanly as if it had been scheduled, which, in a sense, it had been. The 3 men were alive. That was the first thing the Polanski brothers established, because the alternative would have changed the nature of the situation significantly. They were alive, seated on the concrete floor against the far wall, bound at the wrists with zip ties, and with the particular look of people who have spent the night afraid and are currently too exhausted to be anything but relieved that the people who just found them are not the people who put them there. The older Polanski brother, his actual name was Gregor, though almost nobody used it, called Dominic. Dominic called Vincent. Vincent listened to the report without speaking, made a sound that was not quite a response, and said he'd be there in 40 minutes. He was there in 32. The warehouse was cold and smelled like concrete and the particular metallic absence of things that had recently been removed. Vincent stood in the center of the empty space and looked at it the way a man looks at something that has been stolen from him. Not the stolen thing itself, which was already gone, but the space where it was, which still had the shape of what was missing. One of the 3 men, the youngest, barely 22, whose name was Carter, and who had been with the organization for 8 months and was currently the color of old paper, said, "They didn't speak, not one word. 3 of them. Came in through the east loading door with a code they shouldn't have had us on the floor in under a minute, and they didn't say anything, not one word the whole time. Vincent looked at him. 3. 3 that I saw. Could have been more outside. Describe them. Carter did his best. The descriptions were general enough to be useless and specific enough in one detail to be interesting. All 3 had moved with the economy of people who had done this before. Not muscle, not bouncers or enforcers, with the blunt efficiency of simple violence. Something more practiced than that. Something almost technical. Vincent stood in the empty warehouse for 22 minutes. He walked the perimeter. He looked at the east loading door, which showed no forced entry because they'd had the code. He looked at the floor, which showed nothing useful. He looked at the ceiling for some reason he couldn't have named, the way people look at ceilings when they're trying to find something that isn't there. This isn't random, he said to Dominic, who was standing 4 feet behind him. No. This isn't a competitor moving on territory. Competitors don't leave the men alive, and they don't move the inventory without moving it somewhere I can find and get back. Dominic said nothing, because he agreed and had nothing to add to the agreement. Someone is sending me a message, Vincent said. What I need to know is what the message is. He turned around and walked toward the exit. At the door, he stopped without turning back. Don't mention the warehouse to Sal. I need to know who tells Sal about this before I do. Dominic absorbed that, nodded once. Understood. Vincent left. Adrian was in his apartment at 8 that evening when Ray Cutler called again. The warehouse worked, Ray said, and his voice had a different quality than it had this morning. Something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was adjacent to it. Clean extraction, no injuries, your people were in and out in 11 minutes. I know. He'd already received confirmation through a separate channel. What's the fallout? Vincent went to the site personally. Adrian sat up slightly. He'd expected Dominic. He'd estimated a 30% chance Vincent would go himself. Had built contingencies around both options. But the fact of his father standing in that empty warehouse looking at the space where things used to be, landed with a specific weight he hadn't fully prepared for. How'd he look? A pause. What? When he was at the warehouse. How did he look? Ray was quiet for a moment, and Adrian could hear him processing the question, the unusualness of it, the personal current running underneath it. My guy said he looked controlled, the way he always looks. But there was something else. He said it seemed like Vincent was actually thinking, not just reacting, like he was trying to solve something instead of just being angry about it. Adrian nodded at the wall across the apartment. Good. Good? Angry men make predictable decisions. A man whose thinking is more dangerous, but also more, he paused, reachable. Another silence. Then Ray said, Adrian, are you sure you know what you're doing with this? Not the logistics. I understand the logistics. I mean, he stopped, started again. What's the end of it? In your head. What does the last frame look like? It was a fair question. It was the question Adrian had been circling for 2 years. The question he'd approached from every angle and then stepped back from before it fully resolved. He knew what he wanted to dismantle. He knew what he wanted to expose. He had a less complete picture of what he wanted to happen afterward, in the space where those things used to be. I'm working on that part, he said. That's not reassuring. It's not supposed to be reassuring. It's supposed to be honest. Ray exhaled. A long, tired sound, the sound of a man who has spent decades in rooms where the truth was the most dangerous thing present. Your mother know how far along this is? No. You should tell her. Not yet. Adrian? Not yet, Ray. His voice was quiet, but the end of the conversation was in it, and Ray heard it. I'll reach out Thursday. Keep to normal schedule until then. He ended the call and set the phone on the table and sat in the quiet apartment with his own thoughts for a long time. He thought about Vincent standing in that warehouse. He thought about a man who had never once in 6 decades stood in an empty space that someone else had created, who had always been the architect of emptiness in other people's lives, and who was now for the first time on the receiving end of a particular kind of education. He thought, not yet. He thought, but soon. 3 days later, Sal Greco walked into Vincent's office at 4 in the afternoon and closed the door behind him. Vincent was at his desk. He had a document in front of him that he'd been reading for the last hour with the specific quality of attention that means you're reading the same paragraph repeatedly because your mind keeps sliding off it. Sal sat across from him without being invited, which was the privilege of 23 years.
"There's something you need to know," Sal said. Vincent put the document face down on the desk. He looked at his consigliere, at the compact, watchful face he'd known since they were both 38 years old, at the steady hands and the careful eyes, at the man who had sat beside him in a hospital waiting room 21 years ago and talked for 40 minutes. "Tell me," Vincent said, "the disruptions, the warehouse, the money routes, the February situation." Sal placed his hands on the armrests of the chair. Still, deliberate, the posture of a man who has prepared this conversation carefully. "I have reason to believe it's not a competitor. It's not enforcement pressure. It's someone who knows us specifically, knows our architecture, our timing, our internal structures." He paused. "Someone personal." "How personal?" "I think—" Sal stopped. Something moved across his face that Vincent had never seen there before. Something that in another man would have been hesitation, but in Sal had the look of a calculation being finalized. "I think it may be connected to something from a long time ago. Something I should have—" Another pause, shorter this time. "Something I should have told you differently than I did." The room was very quiet. Vincent's right hand was on the desk. I was aware of it in a way he wasn't normally aware of his hands. The document was face down beneath it. "Go on," he said. "The woman, Elena Brooks." Sal's voice was unchanged, completely, carefully unchanged. "After you separated, the boy she had—" "Don't." Vincent's voice came out low, not loud. Low in a way that was worse than loud. "Whatever you're about to say, Sal, think very carefully about whether you're saying it because it's true or because you've decided it's time to say it." Sal looked at him, the careful eyes. 23 years. "I manipulated what you were told," Sal said, "about the boy, about whether he was yours." The silence that followed that sentence was different from the silence before it. It had texture, weight, the specific density of something that has been compressed for 21 years finally being released into open air. Vincent didn't move for 7 seconds. Then he picked up the document from the desk and set it aside very carefully, the way you move something out of the way when you need the space for what comes next. And he looked at the man sitting across from him who had been his most trusted person for more than 2 decades, and his face did something it almost never did. It showed what was underneath. "Why?" Vincent said. One word, barely a word, just the shape of the question. Sal straightened slightly. His chin came up. Not defiance, calculation. Even now, even in this room with this particular silence pressing down on both of them, Sal Greco was calculating. "Because you were going to step back. You'd said it. 6 months before the boy was born, you told me you were thinking about legitimizing everything, pulling out of the network, letting it run under different management. Elena was the reason. You were going to do it for Elena and the family you thought you were building." Sal's voice was even, factual. The voice of a man presenting a business case. "That wasn't acceptable. The organization needed you. I made a decision." "You made a decision," Vincent repeated. "Yes. You made a decision that put my son—" Vincent stopped. His voice had done something at the word son, a small fracture, there and gone in a tenth of a second. "My son and his mother out of my life for 21 years because you decided the organization needed me." "The organization did need you." Vincent stood up. He didn't do anything else. He just stood up, which in the context of this conversation and this room and 23 years of what they knew about each other was enough to change the temperature of the air between them entirely. Sal didn't move. He held Vincent's gaze with the steadiness of a man who had known this moment was coming and had spent time preparing himself to survive it. "I know what you're thinking," he said, "and I know what you're capable of, but you need to hear the rest of it before you make any decision." "The rest of it?" "The boy, Elena's son." Sal kept his voice flat. "He's not hiding somewhere trying to stay clear of this life. He's the one who has been taking the routes apart. The warehouse, the money, all of it." He watched Vincent's face. "He found his way to us, Vincent. He built something designed specifically to dismantle what we built, and he did it from the inside out. And he did it without anyone recognizing him because nobody knew to look for him. A pause. He knows who he is. He knows who you are. And he is very, very good at this. The room held the two of them in its quiet for a long moment. Vincent's right hand was at his side. The left was on the back of his chair. His knuckles on the chair back were white with a pressure he was not aware of applying. His name, Vincent said, Adrian Brooks. The name hit him in a place he hadn't known was still open. He had not said the name, had not heard the name, in 21 years. Elena had said it, in the hospital. In the room where he'd closed a door, she'd said it with that flat, devastated precision, and he had walked out and not looked back and had filed the name in the same place. He filed all the things he'd decided not to feel. The file hadn't held. He's coming for us, Sal said. And before you decide what to do about me, and I understand what you're going to decide about me, Vincent, I have always understood the consequences of my choices. You need to decide what to do about him, because he's past the point of being stopped quietly. He's too far in. Vincent looked at the man across the desk from him, at the careful, steady, 23-year face. Get out of this office, he said. Don't go anywhere I can't find you. And Sal, he waited until Sal was at the door. If you've given me incomplete information just now, if there is a single thing about my son you've withheld to protect yourself. He stopped. Let the silence carry the rest of it, because the silence could carry it better than words. Sal left. Vincent stood alone in his office for a long time. The city spread itself outside his window in the last light of the afternoon, orange, pink, and indifferent, doing what cities do while the people inside them absorb things that change the entire shape of everything that came before. He picked up his phone, put it down, picked it up again.
He didn't know Adrian's number. He didn't know his address. The city hummed outside the window. There was no going back from this point, for either of them, and they both understood it now. And the understanding sat in the air between their two locations like a wire pulled to the last degree before it. The wire snapped. That was how Adrian thought of it in the 3 seconds after the alert landed on his phone. Not as a notification, not as data, but as a physical sensation, like something that had been held under tension for 2 years suddenly releasing all at once. The tripwire he'd buried in the Moretti communications infrastructure had done exactly what he'd built it to do. His name had been searched. The search had originated from Vincent's personal credentials. His father knew he existed. He sat with that for exactly as long as he could afford to sit with it, which was about 90 seconds, and then he picked up the phone and called Ray Cutler. Ray answered on the first ring, which meant Ray was already awake, which meant Ray already knew something. "They're moving," Ray said before Adrian could speak. "How fast?" "Fast. Dominic's been making calls for the last hour. I'm hearing they've put people on 3 separate locations trying to find a financial consultant named Adrian Brooks. They don't have your address yet, but they have your employer." Adrian was already standing, already moving to the closet. "How do you know they don't have the address?" "Because if they had the address, you'd know by now. Different kind of call." That was true. He pulled on a jacket, thought through the next 6 hours in the way he thought through logistics, linearly, without the emotional current that was running underneath everything else. Office was compromised. The car registered in his name was compromised. His phone would need to be left behind within the next 20 minutes. "The secondary location," he said. "Is it clean?" "As of this morning, yes, nobody's been near it. I need 2 hours there. Then I need to move to the contingency." "The contingency's not ready." "Make it ready." He was at the door now. He stopped, went back to the desk, opened the locked drawer, took out the encrypted drive and the backup device, put them in the interior pocket of the jacket. Looked around the apartment once, at the suits hanging in the closet, at the window with its view of the city, at the coffee mug on the counter from this morning, at the life he'd built here, piece by piece, as cover and as actual life simultaneously, until the line between the two had become too blurry to locate. "Ray, one more thing." "Yeah." "My mother." A pause that was very brief but contained a lot. "I'll call her." "Don't tell her what's happening. Tell her I'm traveling for work and I'll be out of reach for a few days, and that I'll call when I can." "She's going to know something's wrong." "She's always known something was wrong. She's been managing that knowledge for 20 years. She can manage it a few more days." He didn't say what he was actually thinking, which was that Elena Brooks had spent 2 decades preparing for exactly this. Not knowing it consciously, maybe, but preparing in the deep structural way of a woman who had always understood that the thing she'd set in motion the day she told her son the truth about his father was not going to resolve quietly. "Tell her I'm fine." "Are you fine?" Adrian opened the apartment door. "I'm operational," he said. He left the phone on the counter, took the stairs instead of the elevator, and walked out of the building into the cold morning air of a city that didn't know anything had changed. The secondary location was a rented room above a dry cleaning business in a neighborhood that had been in the process of gentrifying for approximately 15 years without ever quite completing the transition. The room smelled like solvent and old wood, and the particular staleness of a space that was heated just enough to prevent pipe damage, and no more. Adrian had rented it 11 months ago under a name that connected to a set of documentation he'd spent 3 months building and had never used for anything else. He was there by 7:40. He set up the backup device on the small table by the window and spent 40 minutes running an accelerated version of the damage assessment he'd been planning to run over the next 2 weeks. How much did they know? What could they find? Where were the vulnerabilities in the architecture now that his name was in their systems? The picture that emerged was not as bad as it could have been. They knew the name. They knew the employer. They had presumably whatever Petrov's analysis had produced. The 9 transactions, the routing pattern, the evidence of someone inside their architecture. What they did not have, as far as he could determine, was the full map. The network of former Moretti associates he'd quietly recruited. The documentation he'd assembled over 2 years that detailed the organization's financial structure in more granularity than their own internal records contained. The specific evidence he'd gathered about Sal Greco's movements and communications over the last 18 months. Evidence that told a story considerably more complicated than simple misplaced loyalty. That evidence was the thing. That was the center of it. He'd been building toward a specific moment of disclosure, not just exposing the organization to external pressure, but exposing Sal to Vincent, revealing the 40-minute conversation in the hospital waiting room for what it actually was. Not friendly counsel from a trusted advisor, but the foundational move in a long-term play for control that Sal had been running quietly for 23 years, using Vincent's organization as the vehicle and Vincent himself as the instrument. The plan had been to control the timing of that disclosure, to choose the moment, to put it in front of Vincent when Vincent was already destabilized enough by the dismantling of his financial network that the revelation would land differently. Would land, Adrian had calculated, as the thing that finally broke the structure from the inside, turning Vincent against Sal and creating the fracture that would bring the whole organization into a collapse he could manage from the outside. That plan required time he no longer had. He sat in the cold room above the dry cleaner and looked at the screen and thought about what Ray had said. They're moving fast. He'd underestimated the speed. He'd built his timeline on the assumption that Vincent would take days to respond once the name surfaced, that the disbelief, the processing time, the verification instinct would slow things down. He'd forgotten, or had not fully weighted, that Vincent Moretti had survived 6 decades partly by responding to threats before he fully understood them. His father was faster than he'd accounted for. He was still sitting with that when the door opened. I was on his feet before he finished processing the sound, the backup device in his hand, and his body already oriented toward the window. The window was the secondary exit. He'd mapped it on the first visit, 14 feet to the alley below, survivable if necessary. He stopped when he saw who it was. Ray Cutler stood in the doorway breathing hard, which meant he'd taken the stairs fast, which meant something had changed between his phone call and now. "Sit down," Ray said. "What happened?" "Sit down, Adrian." Something in Ray's voice had a quality Adrian hadn't heard before. Not fear exactly. Something flatter than fear. Something that had already absorbed whatever was coming and was now in the phase beyond shock. "There's something I have to tell you, and I need you to sit down when I tell it." Adrian sat. Ray came into the room and closed the door and stood against it without sitting. He was 63 years old and looked in this moment like every year of it. His face had the particular gravity of a person carrying information they've been carrying too long and are finally setting down. "I've known something," Ray said, "for about 4 months. I've been trying to figure out if it changed anything that mattered, and I convinced myself it didn't, and I was wrong about that. And I'm sorry. I'm telling you now because I don't have the option of waiting anymore." Adrian looked at him. His hands were on his knees. He kept them still. Tell me. Sal Greco didn't act alone in that hospital room. The room was very quiet. What do you mean? Ray's jaw worked for a moment. The story you have, Sal feeding Vincent a lie about Elena, about the boy not being his, to prevent Vincent from stepping back from the organization. He stopped. That's true. Sal did that, but Sal didn't do it on his own initiative. Then whose? There was another person in it. Someone who had more to lose than Sal if Vincent legitimized everything and walked back from the network. Someone who came to Sal 6 weeks before Adrian was born and made an arrangement. Ray finally moved from the door, went to the window, stood with his back to the room for a moment. I found out 4 months ago when I was going through some of the old documentation you had me pull. There was a financial record I recognized that didn't match the story as you understood it. A payment, made from an account I knew. Ray. Adrian's voice was very quiet. Say the name. Ray turned from the window. He looked at Adrian with the expression of a man who is fully aware that what he is about to say will change the shape of something permanently. Danny Caruso, Vincent's older brother. He approached Sal. He was the one who told Sal about the plan to step back, told him what to do about it, gave him the ammunition to make it convincing. The story about Elena and the Ferrara kid, Caruso was the one who sourced it, who put it in a form Sal could use. Adrian didn't move for a long moment. Danny Caruso. He knew the name. Of course he knew the name. He'd spent 2 years mapping the organization, and Danny Caruso was a significant node in the map. Vincent's older brother by 6 years, who had stepped back from active operations a decade ago and now existed in a semi-retired capacity, still connected, still consulted occasionally, still present at certain dinners and certain discussions, but operating with the reduced visibility of someone who had made himself deliberately peripheral. Someone who received regular distributions from the organization's profits without taking on active risk. Someone who had, by stepping back at exactly the right moment, managed to preserve both his wealth and his insulation. Someone Adrian had assessed as low priority. He was aware, suddenly and with complete clarity, of the magnitude of that error. Caruso wanted Vincent running the organization, Adrian said slowly, not because he cared about the organization, but because Vincent was the one who made it produce. Sal was the day-to-day operator, but Vincent was the engine. Without Vincent committed, the whole thing runs at maybe 40% of what it was generating. Ray's voice was steady now. The unburdening had settled him. And Caruso's lifestyle, the houses, the interests in the legitimate businesses, the quarterly distributions, all of that depended on the organization performing at full capacity. He needed Vincent in. He needed Vincent hungry and without the distraction of a family he actually wanted. And he needed it done in a way that Vincent would never question, which is why he needed Sal to do it, because Sal was the one Vincent would believe. Did Vincent know his brother was involved? No, that's the one thing I'm certain about. Vincent's, for all of what he is, the relationship with Danny was always something separate. Ray shook his head. He wouldn't have been able to operate the same way if he'd known Danny engineered it. Adrian stood up. He moved to the window and stood beside Ray and looked down at the alley below. Wet pavement, a dumpster, a single parking spot with a car in it that hadn't moved since he arrived. He looked at it without seeing it. The plan he'd built was predicated on Sal as the architect of what had happened. Sal as the primary betrayer, the one whose exposure would fracture the organization's internal structure. He designed the disclosure around Sal, had built the evidence around Sal's movements, Sal's communications, the financial record of what Sal had gained in the years after Vincent's attention, narrowed to the organization and away from the idea of leaving it. It was a clean story, a coherent one, the kind that, once shown to Vincent, would land with the force of 23 years of misplaced trust suddenly being revealed as calculated manipulation. But it was half the story. And half the story, deployed now under pressure with Vincent already moving and the timeline collapsed, was not enough. Worse than not enough. Half the story, without the Caruso piece, gave Sal something to bargain with. Gave Sal the option of telling Vincent the rest himself, on Sal's terms, in a way that reframed his role as secondary, as following orders, as the instrument rather than the architect. Sal was smart enough to do exactly that. And if Sal did it first, the entire leverage of Adrian's position evaporated. "How solid is the documentation on Caruso?" he said. "The payment record is solid. The source account, the date, the amount, all of it verifiable. There's also a communication record, indirect but traceable if you know what you're looking at, from around the same period." "Where is it?" Ray was quiet. Adrian turned to look at him. Ray was looking at the floor. "Ray? It's with someone else. That's the part of this I'm most sorry about." Ray looked up. His eyes were tired in a way that went past the morning. "When I found it 4 months ago, I didn't know what to do with it, and I reached out to someone I thought I could trust, to get a read on what it meant, what the exposure was. I wasn't careful enough about who that person was connected to." The cold in the room seemed to drop another degree. "Who did you tell?" "A man named Gerber. He worked with Caruso in the early days. He's been out of everything for 8 years. I thought he was genuinely—" Ray stopped. "I was wrong about him." "Does Gerber know about me?" A pause that answered the question before Ray's voice did. "He knows there's someone. He may know the name by now." Adrian looked at him for a long moment. The kind of look that isn't anger. Anger would have been easier to receive, but is instead the careful, complete assessment of a man recalculating everything from this new position. How compromised was the secondary location? How long before Gerber, with Caruso's resources behind him, located it? Whether the contingency location was still viable, or whether it had been on a list Ray had shared with someone in the last 4 months. "Did you tell Gerber about this location?" "No, I never told him about any location. I told him about the documentation, and I showed him a portion of it." "Why?" "Because I was scared." Ray said it plainly, without dressing it up. "I'd been holding it alone for 3 weeks, and I was scared of what it meant, and I made a bad decision." He held Adrian's gaze. "I know what that cost. I'm not asking you to—" "Stop!" Adrian's voice wasn't loud. It had the quiet of a very controlled thing. "I need to think. Don't talk for a minute." Ray stopped. Adrian stood at the window and thought. He thought the way he always thought when the variables changed, from the fixed points outward. What did he know for certain? He knew the name was in Vincent's systems. He knew Vincent was moving. He knew Sal had told Vincent something last night, some portion of the truth, and that Sal had done it on his own schedule for his own reasons, which meant Sal was trying to get ahead of something. He knew Caruso was in this deeper than he'd understood. He knew the documentation that could prove Caruso's involvement was now at least partially in the hands of someone connected to Caruso, which meant Caruso might know what was coming, which meant Caruso had known what was coming for up to 4 months. The thing that had been presented to him as a timeline collapse, Vincent moving faster than expected, might not be about Vincent at all. Might not be about the tripwire alert from last night. Might be about Caruso, who had 4 months to prepare for the exposure of something he'd spent 21 years keeping buried, deciding now was the moment to act preemptively. "Sal reaching out to Vincent last night," Adrian said, "telling him about me, telling him the truth about what happened in the hospital." He turned from the window. Did Caruso know that was going to happen? Ray's face shifted, something connecting. If Gerber told him about the documentation 4 months ago, and Caruso understood what it meant, Caruso would know that once the documentation surfaced, Sal's exposure was inevitable. Sal would have to surface it himself, on the best terms he could get, before I could use it against him. Adrian nodded slowly. So Caruso positioned Sal to be the one who breaks, the one Vincent focuses on. While Caruso... He stopped. His phone, the backup burner, the one he'd brought from the apartment, vibrated on the table, unknown number. He looked at it, looked at Ray, picked it up. "You've been looking in the wrong direction," said the voice on the other end. It was an older voice, controlled, carrying the particular authority of someone who has been in rooms where authority matters for a very long time. He'd never heard it before, but he recognized its quality, the way you recognize a type of instrument, even when you've never heard that specific one played. "Mr. Caruso," Adrian said. A pause. "You're quick. Good. We don't have time for slow." The voice was businesslike, not threatening, or rather, threatening in the way of a very cold day rather than a direct blow. "You've built something impressive. I want you to understand that I mean that without condescension, which is a courtesy I extend to very few people." "What do you want?" What I want is a conversation, in person, today. So you can hand me to Dominic Reyes. If I wanted to hand you to Dominic Reyes, I would have done it 4 months ago when your associate showed me enough of your architecture to locate you 6 different ways. A pause. I did not do that. Consider why. Adrian's jaw was tight. He worked it loose, thinking. Caruso had held off for 4 months, had not moved against him, had apparently let him continue operating, let the warehouse operation happen, let the money routes continue going dark, while knowing approximately who was doing it. You wanted to see how far I'd get, he said. I wanted to see what kind of man you are. The voice on the phone had a quality now that Adrian couldn't immediately categorize. Your father has a particular set of qualities. Your mother has different ones. I was curious which direction you'd fall. And? You fell somewhere I didn't expect, which is why I want the conversation. A short pause. I'm not your enemy, Adrian. I understand you have comprehensive reasons to believe otherwise. I'm asking you to hold that belief in suspension for 3 hours. Give me a reason. Because Sal Greco is going to be dead by tonight if nothing changes. And when that happens, the documentation you've assembled about what happened 21 years ago dies with him, and Vincent will spend the rest of his life believing a version of events that serves nobody's interests, including yours. Another pause. This one had weight in it. And because the man who actually has the power to end this cleanly is the same man you've been trying to destroy, and if you destroy him before he understands the full truth, you'll win the battle and guarantee that nothing actually changes. The room above the dry cleaner was cold and smelled like solvent, and the backup device was on the table with its incomplete damage assessment, and Ray Cutler was standing against the door watching Adrian's face with the expression of someone watching a person navigate a very narrow path over something that drops a long way. Where? Adrian said. Well, the address Caruso gave him was a restaurant in a neighborhood Adrian didn't know well. Not Moretti territory, not neutral exactly, just the kind of ordinary commercial block that existed in the gaps between controlled spaces, too unremarkable to be significant. He was there by 10:15, having taken 3 different routes and spent 20 minutes in a coffee shop 2 blocks away, watching the street in front of the restaurant through the window. Nothing moved wrong. Nothing felt wrong, which he didn't fully trust because things that were designed well didn't feel wrong until they were already operating. He went in. Danny Caruso was already there, at a table in the back corner with his coat still on and a cup of coffee in front of him. He was 67 years old. He looked like someone who had spent a lot of time outdoors decades ago and now spent it indoors. The outdoor quality faded to a general weathered composure. He was not large. He had Vincent's dark eyes, older and more shuttered. He looked at Adrian when Adrian sat down, and for a moment neither of them spoke. And the thing that passed between them was complicated. Recognition without knowing, the particular strangeness of looking at someone who shares your blood and is a complete stranger. You have your mother's jaw, Caruso said. I have my father's eyes, Adrian said, which you'd know since you've been looking at them for 60 years. Caruso nodded once, didn't flinch. Fair. Talk, Adrian said. You have the 3 hours. Caruso wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He was quiet for a moment in a way that was thinking rather than stalling. Then, what I did 21 years ago, commissioning Sal to fabricate what he told Vincent. I am not going to sit here and tell you I regret it the way a man is supposed to regret things. I did it for reasons that were real to me at the time, and I would be lying to you if I said differently. Then what are you going to tell me? That the situation has changed, that what made sense 21 years ago has produced consequences that I did not fully calculate, and that those consequences are now going to kill my brother if nothing changes in the next 12 hours. Adrian looked at him. Explain kill. Sal told Vincent some version of the truth last night. You know this. Caruso's voice was flat and direct. What you may not know is that Sal's version was incomplete in a specific way. Sal told Vincent that the lie about the boy was Sal's idea, Sal's decision, Sal acting alone. Which means Vincent believes the 23-year betrayal sits entirely with Sal. He paused. Vincent is not a man who processes that kind of information slowly. He's been building toward a response since last night. Dominic has positioned people around Sal's residence. Sal is aware of this and is trying to reach Vincent through back channels to negotiate his survival, which means Sal is currently very motivated to offer Vincent something, additional information, additional context, in exchange for time. And the additional information Sal has to offer is you, Adrian said. Is me, exactly. Sal knows my involvement. He kept it as insurance. And if Sal gives me to Vincent as the true architect, Vincent redirects. Sal buys himself time, and Caruso stopped. Something moved in his face that wasn't quite what Adrian expected. I become the man who destroyed Vincent's life for money, which is what I am. And Vincent responds accordingly. You're asking me to save you, Adrian said. I'm asking you to let me help you use the truth correctly before it gets used incorrectly. Caruso's voice didn't change. Your plan was to expose Sal's manipulation to Vincent at a moment of your choosing, using the documentation you assembled to create a fracture inside the organization. That plan is dead. The timeline's gone. The controlled disclosure is gone. What remains is a version of events that is going to reach Vincent through one channel or another in the next 12 hours. And the only question is whose version it is, presented how, with what context and what evidence. And you're offering to present it. I'm offering to present it with me in the room, with my own account of what happened and why, which is the one thing that confirms everything you have documented and makes it impossible for Sal, or anyone else, to reframe it in a way that protects themselves. Adrian looked at the man across the table, at the 67-year-old face that was asking him to accept an alliance with the person most directly responsible for his abandonment. I was aware of the feeling underneath his chest, the thing that had no clean name. And he was aware that the feeling was not useful information in this context, and that acting on it would be a mistake. I was also aware that Ray's 4-month-old error had put him in a position where his options were considerably narrower than they should have been, and that the narrowest option, doing nothing, running the contingency, disappearing and trying to reassemble the operation from scratch, was the one that left Sal alive and Caruso in the shadows, and his father with a version of events that served everyone but the truth. There's a condition, Adrian said. Name it. Everything. All of it. Not a version, not a negotiated disclosure. The complete account, including your role, documented in a form that can be verified independently. Given to Vincent with me present, and whatever Vincent's response is, you accept it. Caruso looked at him. Whatever his response is. Whatever his response is. A silence that lasted long enough to be real, long enough to indicate actual consideration rather than performance. All right, Caruso said. One more condition. Go ahead. My mother. Adrian's voice changed slightly on the word. Not softer, but more direct, more specific. The way your voice changes when you stop talking around something and say the actual thing. She is not part of any of this. Whatever happens with Vincent, whatever happens with the organization, whatever comes out of whatever room we end up in tonight, her name, her account, her life from the last 21 years is completely off the table. You confirm that, or this conversation is over. Caruso didn't hesitate. Done. Say it clearly. Elena Brooks is not part of this. Her name doesn't enter any room I walk into with you and Vincent. He held Adrian's gaze. I know what she went through. I've known for 21 years. I'm not... He stopped. Done. Clearly. Adrian looked at him for another moment. Then he picked up his phone, the burner, and sent a text to Ray that contained a single word and a time. The word was confirmed. The time was 9 p.m. He looked at Caruso. Where? Vincent has a secondary location, a building he uses for sensitive meetings. Sal doesn't know about it. Caruso reached into his jacket and put a card on the table with an address on it. I'll reach Vincent through a channel Sal can't monitor. I'll have him there by 9. Adrian picked up the card. Read the address. Put it in his pocket. And if you're wrong about any of this, if this is the mechanism by which Dominic Reyes meets me in person. Caruso looked at him with something that was almost, not quite, but almost, the expression of a man confronting something in himself that he'd been not confronting for 21 years. Then you'll have the satisfaction of knowing you were right about me. That's not a comfort. No, Caruso said. It isn't. Adrian spent the rest of the day in the secondary location, not the compromised one, but the contingency. A third space, one he hadn't told Ray about, established through a channel that connected to nobody in Ray's world. He sat in the cold quiet of it and went through every piece of documentation he had, reordering it, compressing it, selecting the pieces that would do the most specific work in the least time. He called Ray at 2 in the afternoon and told him what had happened and what was planned. Ray listened and didn't interrupt. And when Adrian finished, said, "This is the most dangerous thing you've done." "I know. Caruso could be playing you." "He could be." "You're going anyway." "Yes." Another of Ray's long silences. "What do you need from me?" "If I'm not reachable by midnight," Adrian said, "there's an envelope at the contingency location in the kitchen drawer. It has instructions. Follow them exactly and don't improvise." "Understood." A pause. "Adrian." "Yeah." "Whatever happens tonight, whatever your father says or doesn't say, whatever the room turns into, you are not responsible for what he does with the truth. You're only responsible for getting the truth into the room. After that, it belongs to whoever has to live with it." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "Tell my mother that, when this is over." "She already knows it," Ray said. He ended the call. At 8:30, he left the contingency location and walked 4 blocks to where a car he'd arranged was waiting. He drove himself. He didn't want anyone else in the car. Not for security reasons, though there were security reasons, but because the 15 minutes between the contingency location and the address on the card were his, and he wasn't ready to share them. He drove through the city in the dark. The streets were wet from a rain that had passed through in the late afternoon, and the lights reflected off the pavement. In the way they do after rain, everything doubling and distorting slightly, the ordinary made briefly strange. He thought about a kitchen window looking at brick. He thought about a woman standing at it, waiting for something she couldn't name. He thought about what Ray had said. "You are only responsible for getting the truth into the room." He pulled up to the building on the card. A commercial building, older, in an area that had been industrial once, and was now in that in-between state of things that haven't decided yet. One light on in the upper floor. A door with a standard lock that the key Caruso had included with the address would open. He sat in the car for 30 seconds. Not hesitating. He was past hesitation, had burned through it somewhere in the middle of the afternoon, but taking the last moment of solitude before whatever the room contained. Then he got out of the car. He was at the door with his hand on the lock when he heard the sound behind him. Not loud, not dramatic, the specific purposeful sound of someone who has positioned themselves and is now making their presence known by choice rather than by accident. He turned around. Vincent Moretti was standing 10 feet away on the wet pavement, without Dominic, without security, in a coat and no tie with his hands at his sides. He looked older than the photographs Adrian had studied. And at the same time, in the dark and the reflected light of the wet street, he looked like something Adrian recognized from a place that wasn't memory exactly, but was something adjacent to it. They stood 10 feet apart on the wet street and looked at each other for the first time. Vincent's face was doing something that a face like his didn't do often. Not controlled, not performing. Something that moved through it the way weather moves through a landscape, visible, unstoppable, not intended for an audience. "You have your mother's jaw," he said. His voice was rougher than Adrian had expected. "And everything else is mine." Adrian didn't say anything. His chest was doing the thing again, the thing without a name. And this time he didn't try to manage it. "Caruso's inside," Vincent said. "He was already there when I arrived." A pause. "I need you to understand something before we go in." His voice changed, still rough, but under it something stripped bare. Something that had been locked for 21 years and was now open to the cold air with the irreversibility of things that can't be reclosed once opened. "I am not asking you to forgive anything. I'm not standing here to tell you the decision I made was anything other than what it was." "What was it?" Adrian said. "Not hostile. Genuine." Vincent was quiet for a moment. The wet street reflected both of them. "The worst thing I have ever done," he said. "And I have done things that should make that a very high bar to clear." The door behind Adrian was unlocked. The room inside was waiting. Caruso was inside with his account and his motivations and his 67-year-old calculation about survival and truth. Whatever came next, whatever the next hour produced, whatever configuration of damage and disclosure and consequence emerged from the room they were about to enter together, was going to be the thing that none of them could walk back from, in any direction, for the rest of their lives. Adrian looked at his father standing in the wet street in the dark. He thought about the hospital room he had no memory of. He thought about the door closing. He thought about everything that had been built in the space that door had created. His mother at the window, his own careful, furious, patient architecture of approach and dismantling, and the long, long discipline of a person who had been abandoned before he could understand what abandonment meant and had spent 21 years building something to answer it. He thought about what Ray had said and what his mother had said in all those Sunday phone calls, and what the stripe of noon light on a linoleum floor looked like in a kitchen in a two-bedroom apartment in a city 300 miles from here. He turned back to the door. "Come in," he said, and opened it. The room smelled like dust and cold metal, and something underneath both of those, something older, the smell of a space that had been used for serious things and remembered them. It was a large room. Industrial-era construction, high ceilings with exposed beams, windows along one wall that had been painted over at some point and never cleared. A table in the center, heavy, functional, the kind of table that had been chosen for durability rather than appearance. 3 chairs. One overhead light that threw hard shadows and left the corners of the room in genuine dark. Caruso was seated at the table when they came in. He looked at Vincent first, the way you look at the person whose reaction matters most. And something moved across his face when he saw Adrian walking in behind his brother. Something that was recognition and calculation, and underneath both, something that might have been relief if it had more room to breathe. Vincent stopped when he cleared the door. He looked at the room. He looked at his brother. "Danny," he said. Caruso stood. He didn't say anything for a moment. He was looking at Vincent with the expression of a man who has rehearsed something many times and has just now, in the actual moment, discovered that rehearsal and reality have different weights. "Sit down," Vincent said. Not a request. Not angry. Not yet. Something worse than angry. Something controlled in a way that was its own kind of pressure. The way a gas compressed into too small a space isn't loud, but is extremely dangerous. Caruso sat. Adrian moved to the side of the table. Not at it, beside it. He put the backup device on the table and opened it, and did not sit down, because sitting down felt wrong in a way he couldn't fully articulate, and so he trusted the instinct. He stood and watched the 2 older men and felt the room's pressure against his skin like weather. "Talk," Vincent said to his brother. "All of it, from the beginning." Caruso talked. He was not a man who did things sloppily, including this. He talked for 22 minutes without significant pause, in a voice that was deliberate and direct and carried no audible plea for mercy. He was not, apparently, going to ask for mercy, which was either courage or the specific dignity of a man who has decided the accounting is the accounting and crying about it is beneath him. He laid out the structure of it. 6 weeks before Adrian's birth. The approach to Sal. The specific nature of what he'd asked for and what he'd offered Sal in exchange. The financial underpinning of his motivation. The distributions. The lifestyle. The calculation that Vincent stepping back would cost him more than he was willing to lose. The story about Elena and the Ferrara boy, sourced and delivered to Sal in a form that would hold under Vincent's scrutiny because it was detailed enough, specific enough, to feel like the uncomfortable truth rather than a fabrication. He said Elena's name twice and stopped himself after the second time, which was the only visible crack in the account. He said Adrian's name once, at the beginning, and didn't use it again. He referred to him after that as the boy, and then as your son. And Adrian noted the shift and filed it. Vincent sat through all 22 minutes without moving. He had his hands on the table in front of him, flat, palms down. His face was the face of a man who is receiving information he has already half absorbed and is now receiving the complete version. And the complete version is both worse and more coherent than the half, which makes it worse in a different way. When Caruso stopped talking, the room held the silence for a long time. Then Vincent lifted his right hand off the table, slowly, and put it down again, like he was testing whether his body still worked. 21 years, he said. Caruso said nothing. I had a son for 21 years and didn't know it because you needed to maintain your quarterly distributions. Vincent's voice was still controlled. The control was what made it terrifying. That's what I'm hearing. Vincent, don't. The word landed flat and final. Don't say my name right now. Don't say anything that sounds like an explanation. You've given me the account. I have the account. I don't need you to help me understand it. Caruso closed his mouth. Vincent looked at Adrian. It was the first time since they'd come into the room that he'd looked directly at him, and the look had a quality of, not apology, Not yet, but the specific expression of a man who is realizing the full dimension of something he's looking at for the first time. How long have you known about Danny? Since this morning, Adrian said. I found out Caruso was in it 4 hours before he called me. And you came here anyway. The documentation I assembled is built around Sal's role. Without Caruso's account, Sal can reframe his own involvement in a way that… He stopped. You needed the complete account. I came here to make sure you got it. Vincent looked at him for another moment. Something moved in his face. That's the only reason. Adrian held his gaze. No, he said. It's not. The silence that followed that held something between them that neither of them had language for yet. It was not reconciliation, nothing that large or clean. It was more like two pieces of the same structure recognizing each other from opposite sides of a long gap. Vincent broke it by standing up. Where's Sal? He said. To both of them. To the room. His residence, as of 2 hours ago, Caruso said. Dominic has people positioned outside. Dominic. Vincent's voice changed slightly on the name. Dominic is one of Sal's people, or mine. Yours, completely. Call him. Tell him nobody moves on Sal until I give the word. Vincent was already at the door. He stopped, turned back, looked at Adrian. I need Sal in a room, not hurt, not touched. In a room where I can put what I know in front of him and watch what he does with it. A pause. I want you there. Adrian picked up the backup device from the table. I'll be there. Vincent looked at his brother. The look lasted approximately 3 seconds and communicated something that a room full of words would have done less efficiently. Then he left. Caruso exhaled, the first visible sign of the pressure he'd been holding since they walked in. He looked at Adrian. He's going to… Don't, Adrian said. Caruso stopped. Whatever he decides about you is his decision. You told him you'd accept it. Adrian looked at the older man. I'm going to need you to mean that. Caruso was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, once, with the particular nod of someone putting something to rest. The documentation you have, about Sal's financial gains, can you transmit it to a third party before tonight? Someone outside all of this who can hold it independently? Already done, Adrian said. 3 copies, 3 parties, 2 hours ago. Something in Caruso's face shifted. Not surprise exactly. More like a final confirmation of a judgment he'd been forming. You really are something, he said. I'm my mother's son, Adrian said, and walked out. The next 4 hours were the kind of hours that compress in memory afterward, not because nothing happens in them, but because everything happens at a pace that the mind can't fully absorb in real time and processes later in fragments. Adrian spent 40 minutes in the car outside the building on the phone with Ray, transmitting a compressed version of what had happened and what was coming. Ray listened with the focused silence of someone taking notes, even when they aren't taking notes. Sal, Ray said, what's Sal going to do when Vincent puts it in front of him? Sal is going to try to survive, which means Sal is going to offer Vincent something he doesn't have yet. Adrian watched the street. The question is what? Sal has been in that organization for 23 years. He knows everything. He knows everything as of however recently he stopped being trusted with everything. Vincent's been pulling back from him for the last 18 months. Adrian thought about the quality of observation he'd been watching in Vincent, the way Vincent had described his unease about Sal's orientation, the small behavioral shifts he'd been cataloging without naming. Sal knows he's been losing ground. A man who knows he's losing ground keeps things. Insurance. What kind of insurance? That's the question I need answered before we put Sal in a room. He looked at the building. The light in the upper floor was still on. Caruso was still inside, apparently, processing whatever a 67-year-old man processes after telling his brother the truth about the worst thing he'd ever done. Call your contact inside, the one who told you Petrov went to Sal. I need to know if Sal has left his residence in the last 3 hours. A pause on Ray's end, the sound of movement. Then, after a moment, working on it. Give me 10. Adrian gave him 10, sat in the car with the engine off and the windows beginning to fog slightly from his breath, and thought about the structure of the next several hours. Vincent was moving to contain Sal. That meant Dominic and however many others Dominic commanded were positioning around Sal's location, creating a perimeter that Sal may or may not have detected. If Sal was smart,
and Sal was undeniably smart. Sal had contingencies for exactly this situation. 23 years of knowing how Vincent operated meant 23 years of knowing what Vincent did when he decided someone had to be dealt with. Sal would have a way out. The question was whether he'd take it or whether he'd try to fight. Ray called back in 8 minutes. He left 40 minutes ago. Car went out the garage, not the main entrance. With how many people? 2, driver and 1 other. Direction, south. That's all my contact could get. South from Sal's residence. Adrian pulled up the city map in his head, the way he'd been doing with the Moretti organization's geography for 2 years. South meant away from the commercial district, away from Vincent's building, away from every Moretti-affiliated property in the primary operational zone. South meant the port area, the warehouse district, the older infrastructure that the organization had used in its early years and technically still owned through property structures that hadn't been cleaned up. It meant the steel mill. He didn't know why he was certain of that. He had no specific intelligence pointing to it. But the steel mill on the southern edge of the old industrial district had been in the Moretti property portfolio for 30 years, was listed under a holding company that hadn't been active since the previous decade, and was the kind of location that a man who had spent 23 years studying Vincent Moretti's habits would know Vincent would never look first because Vincent had essentially forgotten it existed. He called Vincent. Vincent answered on the second ring. Talk. Sal left his residence 40 minutes ago. 2 vehicles, south direction. A pause. The mill, Vincent said. That's my read. Another pause. How do you know about the mill? I've been mapping your organization for 2 years. He said it without apology. The mill is in the holding company portfolio. It's the one significant Moretti property with no current operational use that Sal would know you'd overlook. The silence on Vincent's end had a different quality than the silences before. Not cold. Not the silence of a man processing information. The silence of a man realizing the full dimension of something he's looking at. How many people does Sal have access to? Adrian said. People who are loyal to him specifically, not the organization. Him. 4, maybe 6. There used to be more. He has 2 with him in the car, which means he's meeting others there. Or he's running, going to ground and disappearing. Sal's not running, Adrian said. He was certain of this in the way he was sometimes certain of things that he couldn't fully explain. Not instinct exactly, but the product of 2 years of studying a person through their behaviors and their decisions until you understood the architecture of how they thought. Sal's been in this organization since he was 38 years old. He doesn't have a life outside it. He's not running to a beach in another country. He's repositioning. He's going to that mill because he has something there or because he's meeting someone who has something he needs. The insurance, Vincent said. Yes. Another pause. I'll have people at the mill in 20 minutes. Vincent? He almost didn't say what came next. Then, don't send Dominic's people in first. Sal sees a full assault coming, and whatever he has disappears. A breath. I need to go in first, with you, if you're willing, before he has time to burn it. The silence on Vincent's end lasted long enough that Adrian counted the seconds. 5, 6, 7. I'll pick you up, Vincent said. The mill at 11 at night was the kind of dark that cities don't usually produce. The sodium lights on the perimeter had been dead for years, and the building itself ate the ambient glow of the surrounding blocks, leaving the approach in a genuine blackness that Adrian's eyes were still adjusting to when Vincent's car pulled up beside his. There were 2 other men with Vincent, not Dominic, 2 others, older, the kind of quiet that comes from decades of specific experience. They didn't introduce themselves, and Adrian didn't ask. Vincent looked at the building. East entrance, he said quietly. There's a loading door that hasn't been functional since 2014. The lock was replaced in 2019. I had it done. He paused. I don't know why I had it done. I don't come here, haven't come here in 8 years. Habit, one of the 2 men said. Vincent nodded once. East entrance. There'll be a light source somewhere inside. Sal wouldn't sit in complete dark. He looked at Adrian. You stay close. You understand? Not behind me, not in front. Close. I understand. They went in. The east entrance was exactly as Vincent had described. Loading door, functional lock, opened without sound. The smell inside was the smell of old industry. Rust, oil that had been dry for years, concrete that had absorbed decades of work and held it. The space was enormous. The darkness inside was different from the darkness outside, more textured, full of shapes that resolved slowly as the eye adjusted. A light source in the far corner, not bright, the kind of portable battery lamp that throws a yellow pool and leaves everything beyond it in deeper dark by contrast. Sal Greco was standing at a table underneath it. He wasn't alone. Two men flanked him, not his driver, and the other from the car, different men who had been here waiting when Sal arrived. Both of them had the posture of people who were prepared for something. Sal saw them when they were still 40 feet away. He didn't run. He didn't reach for anything. He stood under the yellow light and watched them come with the expression of a man who had built himself toward this specific moment and was now in it and had decided that whatever else, he would be in it with composure. Vincent stopped 15 feet from the table. Adrian stopped beside him. The two men they'd come with spread out slightly to the sides, not advancing, just present, which changed the geometry of the space. "Vincent," Sal said. "Sal." Vincent's voice was completely even. The controlled quality from the earlier room was still there, but underneath it now something else was present, something that had been compressed for hours and was reaching the limit of compression. "You've been to see Danny," Sal said. It wasn't a question. "I've been to see Danny." Sal's jaw tightened slightly. "Then you know the account he gave you is incomplete. Danny has his version, and it serves Danny, and I have documentation," Adrian said. Sal looked at him for the first time. The look was thorough and unsentimental, the look of a man assessing a problem. "Adrian Brooks," he said. His voice carried something Adrian hadn't expected, not contempt, something closer to acknowledgement. "You've been very careful, very patient." A pause. "You have your mother's temperament." "What documentation do you have that's incomplete?" Vincent said, bringing Sal back, not allowing the deflection. Sal looked at Vincent. The two men who'd come with Sal had not moved, but their stillness had changed slightly. It had become the stillness of people waiting for a signal. "I have 23 years of documentation," Sal said. 23 years of every decision, every transaction, every arrangement you ever made that exists nowhere in the official record. I have it in a form that survives me, Vincent. That's what I came here to tell you, not as a threat. I want you to understand that clearly, as a fact. Because the facts are what we have left at this point, and I'm not interested in games. Vincent said nothing. "I came here tonight because I needed to be somewhere you'd have to come to me, not to run, to have this conversation on ground that isn't yours." Sal's voice was steady. Whatever he felt, fear, exhaustion, the accumulated weight of 23 years of a lie about to cost him everything, none of it touched the surface. "I'm going to give you a choice, Vincent, not because I think I have the right to offer you choices, because the alternative to this choice is a sequence of events that hurts more people than it needs to." "Say it," Vincent said. "I give you everything. The 23 years of documentation, the specific account of what happened with Elena and the boy, my full cooperation with whatever comes after that, everything, in exchange for one thing." Sal paused. "I walk out of this building tonight. I disappear. I don't come back. Everything I have goes to you, and I go nowhere." The yellow light threw hard shadows across everyone's faces. Adrian was aware of his own breathing, controlled, deliberate, the way he'd trained himself to breathe under pressure. He was aware of Vincent beside him, of the absolute stillness Vincent had gone into. "The 23 years of documentation," Vincent said. "Is it here? It's accessible from here, digitally." Sal reached into his jacket, slow, deliberate, telegraphing the movement, and put a phone on the table. "On that device, encrypted. I'll give you the key." One of the two men with Sal moved, not toward Vincent, toward the phone. A small repositioning that changed nothing and everything because it revealed the geometry of his intention without completing it. "Don't," said one of Vincent's men, quietly. The man with Sal stopped. The air in the space had changed. It had acquired the specific tension of a room in which multiple people are calculating simultaneously, and the calculations have not yet resolved into action, but are very close. Adrian could feel it on his skin, could feel the prickling at the back of his neck that was his nervous system processing threat data and reporting it in the most basic available language.
The man on your left is going to be a problem in approximately 30 seconds, Adrian said quietly to Vincent. His right hand hasn't been visible since we came in. Vincent didn't look at him. I know. Sal, Adrian spoke past Vincent. Whatever your man on the left is holding, have him put it on the table. Now. Sal's eyes went to the man. Something passed between them. The compressed communication of people who have worked out arrangements in advance. Then the man's right hand came out from behind his leg and put a compact pistol on the concrete floor and stepped back from it. Thank you, Adrian said. Sal looked at him. You're good at this. I've been studying your organization for 2 years. I know how your people are positioned. I know. Something in Sal's voice had changed, flattened. I've known about you for longer than you think, Adrian. Not the specifics, not your name, not your face. But I knew that something was coming from the direction of the past. I could feel the shape of it. He paused. You moved like someone with a personal account to settle. The money routes, the warehouse. It wasn't the efficiency of a competitor. It was the efficiency of someone who needed it to mean something. Vincent made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Sal looked at him. I'm sorry, he said. And the thing that made it devastating wasn't the words. It was that they were completely unadorned. No qualification, no context. No, the organization needed it, or you would have destroyed what we built. Just the 2 words, said by a man who had earned the specific loneliness of a person who has nothing left to protect except the integrity of a single true statement. Vincent stood in the yellow light and received it with a face that was doing several things at once, none of them small. He stepped forward. He picked up the phone from the table. He held it without looking at it, looking at Sal instead. 23 years of a particular kind of closeness, the closeness of people who know each other in the way only possible through shared stakes, shared danger, the specific intimacy of trust extended repeatedly in high-consequence situations. He had looked at this face across tables and through windows and in rear-view mirrors and in hospital waiting rooms and across the distance of 23 years of a lie that had restructured everything. The key, Vincent said. Sal told him the encryption key, a long alphanumeric string spoken from memory without hesitation, which meant it had been in his head for years in the same category as things you never write down. Vincent handed the phone to Adrian. Verify it. Adrian took the phone and entered the key, and the device opened to a file structure that was, he scrolled through it quickly, with the professional speed of someone who understood what they were looking at. Exactly what Sal had described. 23 years, comprehensive. The kind of documentation that would serve as the foundation for any number of subsequent events, legal and otherwise. He looked up. It's real. Vincent nodded. He looked at Sal. You asked to walk out of here, he said. Yes. Vincent was quiet for a long moment. The 2 flanking men were still. Adrian was still. The mill breathed around all of them with its rust and its dry oil and its memory of industry. No, Vincent said. The word dropped into the silence and sat there. Sal absorbed it. His face didn't collapse. He had prepared for this answer. He had always known this answer was the more likely of the 2. Vincent. Not because of 23 years. Not because of what you told me. Vincent's voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with anger. Because of what's on that phone. Because if you walk out of here with the knowledge of what's on that phone, I never sleep. You know that. You've always known I'd make that calculation. Sal was quiet. But you're not going to Dominic, Vincent said. You're not going to be hurt. You're going to be held, properly, securely, until I've worked out what comes next. He looked at his 2 men. Petrov's brother has a property outside the city. Use that. He looked back at Sal. You have my word you're not touched. That's the best I have for you tonight. Something in Sal's shoulders released. A millimeter. Barely visible. The specific relaxation of a man who has just learned the worst of what's coming and found it survivable. All right, Sal said. The 2 men moved toward him. Sal didn't resist. He walked with them toward the east entrance with the composure of someone who has been in controlled situations before and knows that composure is the most useful thing remaining to him. At the edge of the yellow light, he stopped, turned back. He looked at Adrian. Your mother, he said. She never knew it was me specifically. She always knew something had been done, but she never... He stopped. Tell her that, if it means anything. It doesn't, Adrian said. And then, because he was honest, but I'll tell her. Sal nodded and walked out into the dark. The mill was quiet after he left. Vincent stood at the table with the portable lamp throwing its yellow light up across his face. He looked old in that light. He looked like a man at the end of a very long road who has arrived at something he doesn't have a clean name for. Adrian was still holding the phone. He set it on the table. I need to ask you something, he said. Vincent looked at him. The documentation on this device, it covers 23 years of operations, transactions, arrangements. He looked at his father. What are you going to do with it? Vincent was quiet. Because if you use it to protect the organization, to clean up exposure, to eliminate the people whose names are in it, then tonight meant something different than I thought it meant. Adrian kept his voice even, not accusatory, honest, the way his mother had always been honest, with the directness of someone who had decided that accuracy mattered more than comfort. And if that's what happens, then I need to understand that now rather than later. Vincent looked at him for a long time. The yellow light, the rust, the dry smell of old industry. What did you want to happen? Vincent said. At the end of all this. The real answer, not the strategy. Adrian looked at his father, at the silver-haired man in the coat who had stood on a wet street 2 hours ago and said the worst thing I have ever done, with the particular voice of someone saying a true thing for the first time. I wanted the truth in the room, he said. I wanted you to know what was done. I wanted... He stopped, took a breath, let it out. I wanted to exist, to you, as a fact, as your son, not as an absence. He looked at the table. The organization, the documentation, what happens to the network. I have plans for that. I have ideas. But he looked up. That part I can build. I've been building for 2 years. The other part. He shook his head slightly. I couldn't build that. Vincent's face was very still. The stillness of something that has been in one position for a long time and is considering whether to move. The documentation, he said. The phone. I'm going to give it to you. He said it like a decision being made in real time, which was what it was. Do with it what you were going to do, whatever that is. Adrian looked at him. You understand what I was going to do. You were going to dismantle it, Vincent said. The network, the financial structure, convert the legitimate businesses, cut the rest loose, give the regulatory bodies what they need to clean up what can't be converted. He said it without visible emotion. I'm not stupid, Adrian. I've been looking at what you've done for 2 years from the inside, and I understand what an intelligent person with the right information and enough patience could accomplish. A pause. You weren't trying to take it over. You were trying to end it. Yes. Why? Not hostile, genuinely asking. You could have, because it needed to end. Adrian's voice was quiet and certain. Not for revenge. Because it's time. Because there are families inside the legitimate businesses that don't know what they're part of, and there are people on the outer edges who are there because they had no better option and could have one, and there are... He stopped. Because my mother raised me in a 2-bedroom apartment with a kitchen window that looked at a brick wall, and she was the smartest, most capable person I have ever met, and the reason she spent her life in that apartment instead of somewhere with a view was because this organization and the man who ran it put her there. He looked at Vincent. I'm not saying that to hurt you. I'm saying it because it's true. Vincent received it. He didn't deflect or qualify. He received it the way you receive something you owe someone. The documentation, he said. It's yours. Adrian picked up the phone. Outside the mill, somewhere in the dark and cold of the industrial district, a sound arrived that changed the temperature of everything. The specific, sharp mechanical sound of a vehicle approaching fast on the access road. Then another. Then the kind of purposeful silence that follows when multiple vehicles stop simultaneously and people get out of them with intention. Adrian and Vincent looked at each other. That's not Dominic, Vincent said. No, Adrian said. How many people know we're here? Caruso knew we were meeting. He knew the address. Adrian was already moving, putting the phone in his jacket's interior pocket, looking toward the exits. How many people does Caruso have access to? Danny? Vincent's voice had a quality in it Adrian hadn't heard before. Danny wouldn't... How many people does he have access to? Adrian said again, harder. Vincent's face went through something quickly. The recalculation. The specific expression of a man discovering that an account he thought was complete had one more entry. A few. He has a few loyalists, men who came up with him before he stepped back. And if Caruso decided tonight that the cleanest outcome for Caruso is a version of events where neither of us walk out of this building, then he solves his problem completely, Vincent said. The words came out flat and certain. No one left who knows the full account. My people assume Sal did it. Sal's in custody and can't prove otherwise. He looked at the entrance. Danny solves everything in one move. Adrian was looking at the exits. East entrance, the way they'd come in. The two men who'd come with Vincent were at the far end of the building, out of voice range. The lamp was still burning on the table, which meant they were visible and anyone coming in from the entrance would see them before they saw anyone. He turned the lamp off. The darkness was total for 3 seconds before his eyes began the adjustment. West wall, he said quietly. There's a secondary access point. I saw it on the property schematic. Service door, originally for the electrical infrastructure. If your people can get to the east entrance from outside and we go west, splits their attention, Vincent said. He was already moving. In the dark, his footsteps were deliberate. You know the layout. I studied everything. Adrian was beside him, matching his pace, moving through the dark with his hand finding the edge of the wall and following it. Vincent, if we get out of this building, tonight, there are things that need to happen quickly. The documentation needs to go to specific people before Caruso has time to find it or suppress it. I have a protocol, I have the copies at 3 external locations, but it needs to be initiated from a device I don't currently have access to. Tell me what you need. 10 minutes in a secure location with internet access, that's all. After we get out of this building, Vincent said. After we get out of this building, Adrian agreed. They were at the west wall now. Adrian's hand found the service door. Metal, cold, hinged to open outward. He felt for the latch. Found it. The latch was stiff from disuse, and he put pressure on it carefully, slowly, without the sound of force. Behind them, at the east entrance, the sound of the main loading door, the one they'd come in through, beginning to move. The latch released. The door swung outward into the cold night air of the alley behind the mill, and Adrian went through it first, and Vincent came through a half-second behind him, and the alley was dark and cold, and smelled like standing water, and the particular nothing smell of dead industrial space, and somewhere behind them inside the building a light came on. Someone's flashlight, sweeping through the interior. They ran. Not in panic. In the controlled urgency of people who understand the geometry of pursuit, and are applying it, distance from the building, angle to minimize visibility, movement toward the street where other vehicles and other people existed and complicated the calculus for anyone following. Vincent was faster than Adrian expected. 61 years old, and he ran like someone who had kept something in reserve for exactly this occasion. Not young, not graceful, but relentless in the specific way of a man who has survived a long time by understanding when speed is non-negotiable. They hit the street together, breathing hard. Adrian pulled out the burner, called Ray. I need an extraction. I need it now. I need the Kimball Street coordinate. 2 minutes, Ray said. He didn't ask questions. Vincent was bent slightly at the waist, hands on his knees, getting his breath back. He looked up at Adrian. His face in the streetlight was sweat-damp and hard, and had an expression Adrian hadn't seen there before. Not fear, not relief. Something rawer than both. Something that was his father looking at him across 3 feet of sidewalk in the cold dark with the full weight of 21 years and everything that had just happened in the last 3 hours pressing down on both of them simultaneously. You said 10 minutes, Vincent said between breaths. With internet access. Yes. My driver has a secured vehicle 2 blocks north of here. He straightened. Get in it with me and you have your 10 minutes. Adrian looked at him, at his father's face, at the man who was 61 years old and had just run through a dark building with him and had given him the documentation and had said do with it what you were going to do and was now offering him 2 blocks north and 10 minutes in a secured vehicle. Ray, he said into the phone. Cancel the extraction. I'll be in touch in 20 minutes. He ended the call. He looked at Vincent. 2 blocks north, he said. They moved. Behind them, in the mill, someone had found the service door and come through it, and the sound of footsteps in the alley was audible now. Not close, but coming. 2 sets. Moving with purpose. Vincent's phone was in his hand, already dialing. Dominic, the mill, south side, 2 men coming out the West Service alley. I need them stopped, and I need them held. A pause. No, not hurt. Held. He put the phone away. He didn't break stride. Dominic has people 4 blocks away. They were positioned for Sal's location before I redirected. You had coverage on the mill already. I had coverage everywhere I thought was relevant. He glanced at Adrian as they moved. I've been in this business for 40 years. I don't go anywhere without coverage. You came in through the east entrance with 2 men. I came in through the east entrance with 2 men, and Dominic had 6 more at the perimeter, and I had 2 vehicles on the access road. He looked forward. I know how to read a situation, Adrian. I knew Caruso was a possibility. Adrian absorbed that, the calculation, the coverage. His father walking into that building not because he was reckless, but because he'd already built a net before he walked in. The apple in the tree. The particular architecture of a man who thinks in contingencies. The secured vehicle, he said. How secured? Encrypted satellite connection, RF shielding, clean power supply. My people built it. A pause. I use it when I need to work without records. He looked sideways at Adrian. You're going to use it to start dismantling my organization. Yes. Vincent was quiet for half a block. All right, he said. The vehicle was where he said it was. A dark SUV that looked ordinary from the outside. The driver, a young woman who didn't react to either of their appearances or their breathing or the general evidence of the last 20 minutes, unlocked it without a word and handed Vincent a tablet and sat in the front with the partition closed. Inside it was very quiet. The RF shielding made the silence different from regular silence. Flatter, more complete. Adrian pulled out the backup device and connected it to the vehicle's encrypted network and began initiating the protocol he'd spent 2 years building toward. Vincent sat beside him and watched the screen. He didn't ask questions. He watched with the focused attention of a man who is observing the dismantling of something he built and has decided that observation is what he owes it. The first transmission went through at 12:47, then the second, then the third. Across 3 cities, 3 independent parties received encrypted packages containing documentation that, once opened and verified, would begin a sequence of events that the Moretti organization's financial structure could not survive intact. Regulatory, prosecutorial, structural. The kind of exposure that doesn't happen fast and doesn't happen loud, but happens completely and cannot be reversed. Adrian initiated the 4th transmission, the largest, the most comprehensive, the one that would take 11 minutes to complete, and leaned back in the seat and looked at the ceiling of the silent vehicle and breathed. Beside him, Vincent said nothing for a long time. Then, Elena. Adrian looked at him. Is she safe? Vincent said. Tonight, with whatever Caruso was trying to do. She's in a different city. Caruso never had her name or her location from me. Ray's protocol is to check on her if I go dark, and I haven't gone dark. He looked at his father. She's safe. Vincent nodded. He was looking at his hands. He stopped. I'd like to see her. If she's willing. I understand if she isn't. A pause. I understand if she'd rather. I'll ask her, Adrian said. That's all I can do. That's more than I have any right to ask for, Vincent said. The 4th transmission was at 60%. Outside the shielded vehicle, the city continued its nighttime operation. Cars, lights, the movement of people living their lives in the complicated, ordinary way. Inside, the 2 of them sat in the flat, complete silence of the shielded space and waited for a transmission to complete that would reshape both their lives irreversibly. 70%. Vincent said, When you were building this, the 2 years, did you ever... He stopped, started again. Did you ever consider not doing it? Adrian thought about it honestly. Yes. What stopped you? The window, Adrian said. His voice was quiet. My mother's kitchen window, 3 feet of alley and a brick wall. He looked at the screen. I couldn't leave that as the end of the story. 80%. Vincent was looking at the partition. I'm going to turn myself in, he said, after tonight. After the documentation is where it needs to be and the people who need to be protected are protected. He said it with the flatness of a decision already made. Not because of what's on this device, because I should have done it a long time ago and I didn't, And the reason I didn't was always the organization, or the power, or the structure, and none of those reasons are good enough anymore. Adrian looked at him. Adrian. Vincent turned. His face in the dim interior light of the vehicle was the face of a 61-year-old man with silver hair and his son's eyes looking at his son for the first time and trying to say something in the limited language available for things of this size. I know there's nothing I can... Don't, Adrian said. Not harsh. Not tonight. Tonight is not the right time for that conversation. Vincent stopped. But, Adrian said, there will be a right time. I'm not closing that door. He looked at his father. I didn't do any of this to close a door, I did it to open one. 90%. The transmission completed at 1:11 in the morning. Adrian looked at the final confirmation on the screen. All 4 transmissions, all 3 parties. The documentation that contained 23 years of the truth about the Moretti organization, and 21 years of the truth about one decision in a hospital room, now existed in places where it could not be suppressed or erased or bought back. He sat with it for a moment. Then he looked at Vincent and said, "It's done." Vincent looked at the screen, at the confirmation, at the end of the thing he had built and the beginning of whatever came after it. He put his hand on the partition and knocked twice. The driver's side window lowered a fraction. "Take us somewhere quiet," he said. "Somewhere with coffee." "Yes, sir," the driver said. The vehicle moved. Outside, the city spread itself in every direction, in its orange and its dark, full of lives and debts and distances and things that had been compressed for too long, finally releasing into the cold open air of a night that was almost over, almost but not yet, hanging at the edge of whatever came after it with the specific suspension of a held breath that is about to become an exhale. And in the quiet of the shielded vehicle, a father and a son sat side by side in the particular silence of people who have arrived somewhere neither of them expected to reach, still breathing, still here, with the long, difficult work of aftermath waiting just beyond the glass. The coffee shop was the kind that exists in every city and belongs to none of them. Open late, fluorescent lit, the kind of place where the booths have been reupholstered twice and the menu hasn't changed since the previous decade, and nobody asks why you're there at 1:30 in the morning, because everyone there at 1:30 in the morning has a reason they're not sharing. They took a booth in the back. Vincent ordered black coffee. Adrian ordered the same, which made something move across Vincent's face. A small thing, quickly controlled, but present. They sat across from each other in the fluorescent light with the coffee between them, and neither of them spoke for a while. Not uncomfortable silence. The silence of two people who have just come through something at high speed and are now in the deceleration, feeling the specific weight of the previous several hours settling into their bodies all at once. Adrian's hands were on the table. He noticed a cut on the back of his right hand that he didn't remember getting, small, already dried, probably from the edge of the service door at the mill. He looked at it for a moment and then stopped looking at it. "Caruso," he said. Vincent wrapped both hands around his mug. Dominic has people going to his residence now. He may not be there. He may not be. But he has nowhere significant to go. Danny has money and he has contacts, but he doesn't have... Vincent paused. He doesn't have the capacity for a real disappearance. He's 67 years old and he has a bad hip, and he's been comfortable for a long time. Comfortable people don't disappear well. What happens to him? Vincent looked at his coffee. "He's my brother," he said, and then after a moment, "He's also the man who took my son from me for 21 years. He looked up. "I haven't figured out how to hold both of those things in the same hand yet." "You don't have to figure it out tonight." "No," Vincent said, "but I'll have to figure it out." The coffee shop had 3 other customers. A young man with headphones in at the counter, 2 women in their 50s sharing something on a phone and laughing quietly about it. Normal people doing normal late-night things. Adrian looked at them briefly and felt the distance between their world and the booth he was sitting in as a physical sensation, like the difference in air pressure between 2 elevations. "The documentation," Vincent said. "The people who received it tonight. What's the timeline?" "The regulatory materials go to the relevant agencies with a 30-day processing window before anything becomes public. The prosecutorial package has a 60-day sealed period while they verify and build the case structure. The structural documentation, the financial architecture, that goes to a separate party who will begin the process of unwinding the network through legitimate channels."
Adrian looked at his father. It's not fast. It's not designed to be fast. Fast is chaotic, and chaotic hurts people who shouldn't be hurt. The employees, the people in the legitimate businesses. Protected as far as I can protect them. The legitimate operations are genuinely viable as independent businesses. The hotels, the property management, the restaurant holdings. Most of those can be separated cleanly from the network and continue operating. I've had a restructuring specialist reviewing the architecture for 4 months. He paused. I was going to do this with or without what happened tonight. Tonight just changes who's cooperating. Vincent absorbed that. You were going to do it alone. I was going to do it without you knowing it was me doing it. He said it plainly. The plan was for the organization to be largely unwound before you had any confirmation that it was Adrian Brooks behind it. And then you'd know. After the fact, when there was nothing to fight over anymore. He looked at his father. I wasn't going to hide from you permanently. I needed it done first. I needed it to not be something you could stop. Vincent nodded slowly. Something in his face was working through a calculation that went beyond logistics. You didn't trust that if I knew who you were, I'd let it happen. Would you have? A long silence. Honest. I don't know, Vincent said. 6 months ago, I would have told you no. I would have reacted. The way I react to threats. He looked at his hands around the mug. But 6 months ago, I also didn't know you existed. The knowing changes the math. It usually does. Vincent looked up. And something in his face, in the exhausted, silver-haired, fluorescent-lit face of a 61-year-old man at 1:30 in the morning in a booth that smelled like old vinyl, was trying to say something that his particular history hadn't given him the vocabulary for. He had spent 61 years being a man who communicated in consequences, in leverage, in the specific language of power and its distributions. The language of this moment was different, and he was learning it in real time, which was the hardest way to learn anything. I meant what I said, he said, about turning myself in. I know. I'm not saying it because of the documentation. The documentation is going where it's going, and there's nothing I can do about that, and I'm not trying to position myself as cooperative to soften what comes. He looked at Adrian steadily. I'm saying it because I've been running from accountability for 40 years, and it has cost everything that was actually worth having, and I'm done running from it. Adrian looked at his father. When? A week, maybe 2. There are things I need to put in order first. There are people in the organization who are there because of loyalty to me personally, not because of what we were doing. I owe them a proper transition, not an ambush. He paused. And I want to see your mother first. If she'll see me. I understand if she won't. I'll ask her, Adrian said again. That's still all I can do. It's enough, Vincent said. It's more than enough. The young man at the counter took his headphones out, paid, left. The 2 women were still sharing the phone, still laughing at something. The fluorescent light hummed its single note above the booth. Tell me something, Vincent said. Adrian waited. When you were building it, the 2 years, how did you... He stopped. Restructured. What was it like doing this while also just living? The question surprised him. Not because it was strange, but because it was human. Genuinely curious, not tactical, the question of a man who wanted to know something about his son's life rather than something about his son's plan. Hard, Adrian said. The work wasn't hard. The work I could do in my sleep. The living part alongside it. He thought about the apartment, the suits, the Sunday calls. There were days when I'd be sitting in a meeting with a client talking about debt restructuring, and I'd think, I have an encrypted drive in my desk that contains the architecture of the most feared criminal organization in this state, and I spent last night mapping another money route to shut down, and now I'm discussing a refinancing schedule for a man who owns a landscaping company in Denver. He almost smiled. Not quite. The distance between those 2 things was very large. Did anyone know? Anyone at all? Ray. A few others who were necessary. He paused. My mother knew something was happening. She didn't know the specifics. She's smart enough to have figured out more than I told her, but she's also smart enough to know when not to ask. She always was, Vincent said quietly. The smartest person in every room she was ever in. He said it with the flatness of a fact long established.
Not romantic, something more honest than romantic. The assessment of a man looking back at something he walked away from and understanding its value in the full clarity of hindsight. I knew that. When we were married, I knew it, and He stopped. I was afraid of it, if I'm honest. A woman who's smarter than you is either a partner or a threat, and I didn't know how to make her a partner. I only knew the other category. Adrian looked at him. She wasn't a threat. I know that now. She raised your son alone for 21 years and built a career from scratch, and never once let the anger she had every right to feel turn me into someone who couldn't think clearly. He kept his voice level, not accusatory. True. She was never a threat to you. She was just a person you had the option to love correctly and chose not to. Vincent received it without flinching. That was the thing about him that Adrian was still calibrating, the capacity to receive truth without deflecting it, which was either a quality he'd always had and rarely exercised or something that tonight had cracked open in him. Yes, he said, that's exactly what it was. They sat with it. The coffee cooled slightly in the mugs. What do you do now? Vincent said. After this? The consulting firm, the life you built as cover. What happens to that? I don't know yet. It was the honest answer. He'd spent 2 years knowing with precision what he was doing and why and how, and the what comes after had always existed as a vague shape at the end of it, a placeholder for the life he'd build once the thing that needed doing was done. I'll figure it out. You're good at that, Vincent said. Not flattery. Assessment. I had good material to work with, Adrian said. My mother's brain and... He paused, looked at his father with something that was not warm yet, but was not cold either. Something that occupied the complicated middle ground between estrangement and recognition. Apparently your instincts for architecture, for building things that hold. Vincent was quiet for a moment. Then he put his mug down on the table and looked at his son across the fluorescent-lit booth in the coffee shop that belonged to no particular city and said, I would like to know you, if you're willing. I'm not asking you to perform a relationship that doesn't exist yet. I'm asking if you're willing to let one exist. Eventually. Whatever shape it takes. Adrian looked at him. He thought about all the years of Sunday phone calls, about his mother's voice describing ordinary things, about the stripe of light on the linoleum, about the 2-year construction project that had lived in the encrypted drive and his head simultaneously, about the weight of a decision made in a hospital room that he had carried without having it explained to him until he was old enough to carry it and then carried it differently for the rest of his life. He thought about the wet street outside the mill, his father's face in the reflected light. The worst thing I have ever done. Said with the specific rawness of a man who had never said it before and knew it was insufficient and said it anyway because the alternative was silence. I'm willing, he said. It wasn't forgiveness. Both of them understood that it wasn't forgiveness, that forgiveness, if it came, would come slowly and quietly over a long time and might not ever be complete, and that was simply the true accounting of what had happened and what it cost. But it was a door. And Adrian had said what he'd said in the mill and meant it. He hadn't done any of this to close a door. He had done it to open one. Vincent nodded. Once. With the nod of a man who has received something he knows he hasn't earned and is not going to pretend otherwise. All right, he said. Then we'll figure out the rest of it. Adrian finished his coffee. It was cold by then, but he finished it anyway because leaving things unfinished was a habit he'd never developed. He called his mother at 6:15 in the morning. He had gone back to the contingency location after the coffee shop, had slept for 3 hours on the narrow bed in the cold room above the dry cleaner. Not well, not deeply, but sufficiently. The sleep of a person who has burned through an enormous amount of something and needs to replenish it before they can do anything else. He woke up with the gray pre-dawn light coming through the single window and lay on his back for a while looking at the ceiling and listening to the building's sounds. He called her at 6:15 because that was when she woke up. Had woken up at 6 every morning for as long as he could remember, without an alarm, the specific biological clock of a woman who had been getting up early to get things done for 21 years. She answered on the 3rd ring. Adrian. Her voice was the voice of someone who had been awake for a while and had been waiting. He knew that voice. I'm okay, he said. First because it was what she needed and what was true. A breath on her end, long, The breath of a woman exhaling something she'd been holding for days. Ray called me.
I know, he wasn't supposed to tell you much. He told me you were operational, Elena said, which is the word you use when you're trying to tell me you're fine without saying you're fine, which means things were not fine. Things were complicated. Adrian,
I'm okay, Mom. I'm genuinely okay. It's done. Most of it. He sat up on the narrow bed, put his feet on the cold floor. There are things that come next that will take time, but the main thing, what I was building toward, it's done.
A silence on her end. Then quietly,
Did you find what you were looking for? He thought about a booth in a coffee shop at 1:30 in the morning, about silver hair and dark eyes, and the worst thing I have ever done said without embellishment. Yes, he said. I think so. Another silence. Different quality. He was there. Yes. And we talked. In a coffee shop. For about an hour. He looked at the wall across the room. Gray plaster, a water stain in the corner. A room that had never been beautiful, but had been useful. He'd like to see you, if you're willing. He said he understands completely if you're not. The silence that followed was the longest one on the call. He let it be long. He didn't fill it, which was something his mother had taught him. That silence is not an emergency and doesn't need to be treated as one. I'll think about it, she said finally. That's all I asked him I could do. Smart. A pause. Are you coming home? In a few days. I need to be here while some things are initiated. After that, he thought about the apartment with its correct suits and its view of actual sky and its encrypted drive no longer in the desk drawer. I think I'm going to find somewhere different to live. The apartment was, he looked for the word, functional, for what it needed to be. I think I want something that's mine in a different way. Something with a window that looks at something other than brick, Elena said. He almost laughed. Almost. Yeah. Good, she said, simply. That's good. Mom. He stopped. The way you raised me, the way you handled everything, what he did, what happened, and the way you just kept going and kept me functional and never let it make me into something smaller. He stopped again. The words were insufficient, and he knew it. I don't have the right words for it. You don't need the right words, Elena said. You showed me everything I needed to see. You built something. You finished it. You're calling me at 6 in the morning to tell me you're okay. Her voice had a quality in it that he'd heard only a few times in his life. Not soft exactly, but exposed, the way a person sounds when they drop the management of themselves for a moment. That's the right words, Adrian. All of it. He sat in the cold room with his feet on the floor and his mother's voice in his ear and felt the weight of the last 48 hours settling into him the way large things settle. Not quickly, not completely, but undeniably. I'll be home by the weekend, he said. I'll make the thing with the chicken, she said, the one you like. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to. A pause. Let me do the thing with the chicken. Okay, he said. Yes, thank you. They hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. Outside, the city was beginning its early morning assembly. The first vehicles, the specific quiet of a place that is waking up incrementally rather than all at once. He listened to it and then got up and put on his jacket and went out to begin the next part. Dominic found Danny Caruso at 4 in the morning at a hotel 12 miles from the mill. He was in the room registered under a name that wasn't his, with a single suitcase and a laptop open on the desk, and the look of a man who had been sitting with a decision for several hours and hadn't finished making it. He didn't resist. That was what Dominic reported to Vincent at 6 a.m., his voice carrying the particular neutrality of a man who has followed instructions precisely and is reporting the results without editorial. He came quietly. Said he'd been waiting for someone to come. Vincent received this information in the same room on Meridian Avenue where Petrov had laid a folder on Sal's desk, and everything had accelerated. He was alone in the room. He sat in the chair behind the desk and looked at the far wall for a long time. Then he called his lawyer. Not the organization's lawyers, his personal attorney, a woman named Claire Hastings,
who had handled his private affairs for 15 years with the professionalism of someone who asked exactly as many questions as her job required, and not one more. He told her he needed to come in that day, that he needed to discuss a voluntary cooperation arrangement with the federal authorities, that he needed her to be available for a long